listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, events, and more across our country, as well as across the surface of our increasingly fragmented globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, I hope your morning is going well. Let's get into the headlines. First up in COVID news, at least 1,477 new coronavirus deaths and 58,530 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there has been an average of 57,400 cases per day. That is a decrease of 16% from the average 2 weeks earlier. And as of this morning, more than 29,247,000 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus. Just under 529,000 have died from it. City officials predicted Wednesday that all New Yorkers will be eligible to get the coveted COVID-19 vaccine before the end of spring. Currently, between 4 million and 5 million New Yorkers are eligible to get the vaccine. Dr. Jay Varma, de Blasio's senior advisor for public health, went on to say, quote, "We want to be in a situation where vaccine supply exceeds demand," end quote. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton on Wednesday threatened to sue the city of Austin for choosing to keep its COVID-19 mask mandate for businesses in place. The AG accused Austin of not complying with Governor Greg Abbott's recent executive order, which ended his statewide mask mandate and banned coronavirus restrictions on businesses. The governor's order has the force and effect of state law and supersedes local rules and regulations, quote unquote. In a letter to Austin Mayor Steve Adler and Travis County Judge Andy Brown, quote here, UN local health authorities have until 6 p.m. today to rescind any mask mandates or business operating restrictions and come into full compliance with GA 34, end quote. Paxton wrote that on Twitter. Otherwise, on behalf of the state of Texas, I will sue you. He followed the threat with a taunt, writing, quote, city county leaders must not be thinking clearly. Maybe it's oxygen deprivation from quintuple masking, end quote. Meanwhile, the country of Denmark has put its use of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine on hold on reports that some people who received it developed blood clots, and after one person died from blood clots after receiving the shot. They're still trying to understand whether there's a link between the vaccine and the clotting. For now, they seem skeptical, but nevertheless, they're putting the use of that specific vaccine on hold. In national political news, back here in the States, Minnesota Supreme Court denied an appeal from ex-Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin Wednesday. After the state Supreme Court's decision, District Judge Peter Cahill could reinstate a third-degree murder charge. By the end of the day Wednesday, jury selection had seated 5 jurors. The court will need 14 altogether, 12 for deliberations and 2 alternates. And that court will reconvene at 8 a.m. Central Time on Thursday when Cahill will address, that's today, when Cahill will address the third-degree murder charge issue before resuming the selection process. Thomas Lane, J. Alexander Kung, and Tu Tao face charges of aiding and abetting and manslaughter. The Senate on Wednesday confirmed Michael S. Reagan, the former top environmental regulator for North Carolina, to lead the Environmental Protection Agency. Mr. Reagan's mission will be putting forward aggressive new regulations to meet President Biden's pledge of eliminating fossil fuel emissions from the electric power sector by 2035, significantly reducing emissions from automobiles and preparing the United States to emit no net carbon pollution by the middle of the century. The trial of Kyle Rittenhouse, the teenager accused of killing 2 people during protests in Kenosha, Wisconsin over the summer, has been delayed until much later this year, specifically until November 1st. Rittenhouse, 18 years old, is accused of shooting and killing Joseph Rosenbaum and Anthony Huber with an AR-style rifle at an August 25th protest last year, sparked by the police shooting of Jacob Blake. Rittenhouse is also accused of wounding Gage Grosskreutz. He is charged with 2 counts of first-degree homicide and 1 count of attempted homicide. He also faces charges of reckless endangerment and possessing a weapon while under the age of 18. Rittenhouse has pled not guilty to all charges. Prosecutors and Rittenhouse's attorney agreed to delay the start of the trial to give them more time to prepare. In international news, a Saudi court has rejected an appeal by prominent women's rights activist Lujain al-Hathlul that would have allowed her to travel freely. She was sentenced in December to 5 years and 8 months in prison, but was released in February. She was appealing for her sentence to be overturned and a 5-year travel ban lifted. The terrorism court convicted Hathlul on charges of harming national security, seeking to change the Saudi political system, and using her relations with foreign governments and rights groups to, quote, pressure the kingdom to change its laws and systems, end quote. Hathlul said she was sexually assaulted and tortured while in detention, including waterboarding, flogging, and electrocution. Saudi authorities have repeatedly denied allegations of torture and sexual abuse in their prisons. Her release in February came less than a week after the White House called on the kingdom to release political prisoners, including women's rights activists. U.S. President Joe Biden has vowed to pressure Saudi Arabia into improving their human rights record. Although he's gone soft on them so far, at least by most accounts, with not going after MBS over the killing of Khashoggi. Of course, that's the most recent event here, but this is all ongoing with al-Hathlul. That story is still ongoing, and she's still being detained. She's stuck in Saudi Arabia, basically. Just any take on that, Jamarl?
The only take that I have is this kind of glaring, like, for example, the attacks that we would level on other countries for human rights abuses and those type of things. And yet, very soft. Very soft. Like, it's just this glaring difference in our behavior towards friends versus people who aren't. And the same case could come up in a different country, and we will have these guys screaming bloody murder, as opposed to something like this, where it almost basically gets to pass. Yeah, I mean, my hypocrisy is the only retort that I have.
It's true. Well, it seems like we like to weaponize it when we're on the verge of invading somebody. But other than that, I mean, I don't know if we would consider ourselves friends with the Myanmar military coup, but we're not. It's not like we're calling for an invasion over there right now. So it seems like there's some larger strategy in terms of who we choose to indict on their human rights abuses versus who we choose to ignore. And it's not just based on who our pre-existing friends or enemies are. I don't know, though. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe we are declaring invasion plans for Myanmar.
Oh, God, that would be so weird. I mean, it doesn't seem like we have...
It would be effective.
Well, it doesn't seem like Biden has a take on it. I mean, short of we don't like it. But I don't know if he has a take. And honestly, I don't even know... Oh, go ahead.
I'm just saying that's enough of a take that, okay, you don't like it, now what? The United States is in the habit, of course, of using sanctions in order to try to undercut the economic bases of our foes internationally. And so I guess maybe more sanctions. that's the natural thing that the United States would do. Not that that would be particularly good for the Myanmar people, for the Burmese people.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I am very curious about what China does, if it does anything. It is closer. It has a closer fiduciary economic relationship with Myanmar. And, are they going to look the other way purely for business interests? Or are they going to give a concern about what's taking place on the ground? Now, this is one of those cases where China is going to, in some way, define who they are. Meaning, for the longest time, the United States has taken this kind of, we're the authority in the world. We're the leadership in the world. We have the biggest economy in the world. We have the biggest influence, et cetera, et cetera. But for the last, X number of years, China has been dumping a ton of money into other countries with the Belt and Road Initiative and has been gaining influence, not in a military capacity, but more so in an economic capacity. And part of these things of being a statesman is making decisions in regards to what you like and don't like on some level and what you would tolerate or not. When Putin makes this thing of saying, hey, instead of you invading Syria, let's just find another solution for it. That's a statesman, right? That's somebody who's trying to be above it all and trying to find these kind of peacemaker ways of doing it. But that's him taking a purview that I don't necessarily want you invading Syria and doing something about it. What does China do? Does China have a purview? And it's not saying that I'm pushing in one way or the other. I'm just curious, do they have an opinion at all? And if so, what is that opinion? And is that opinion going to be influenced in their relationship with Myanmar? I'm fantastically curious about that.
Well, and we're seeing it happen right now. For now, it seems like their opinion is a soft touch and not deciding to get directly involved. Because as we've spoken with KJ about, you've got dozens of different minority ethnic groups with pre-existing militias, and literally, I don't think we aired this part on Fault Lines. We had an after interview conversation with him that was about as long as the interview itself. But pre-existing militias representing these minority ethnic groups with like armaments factories and munitions factories and independent ways to make what they would need to wage an all-out war on each other. And so if China decides to get involved from the outside, I don't think that would look like a direct invasion. Clearly, that would look like supporting some proxy group, supporting one side and giving them armaments and funding. But if they do so, it's not, they would definitely be able to bring that side up a bit. But that's not going to end the war. It's going to become a long, drawn-out thing. And it very quickly brushes over, if it gets serious enough and if the ethnic divisions get rivalrous enough, it gets close to genocide. And that is not something you want to be engaged in. That's not something you want to treat lightly. And I think, China and the United States, outside players are right to be cautious about entering that situation. That's my brief take. But we got more headlines to get back to here. Speaking of Myanmar, Myanmar's military rulers have accused the ousted leader Aung San Suu Kyi of allegedly, illegally, accepting 600,000 American dollars, 430,000 pounds, and gold. No evidence was provided for the charge. Suu Kyi has been held for the past 5 weeks in an undisclosed location and faces several charges, including causing fear and alarm, illegally possessing radio equipment, and breaking COVID-19 restrictions. Brigadier General Zam Min Tun also accused President Win Myint and several cabinet ministers of corruption. Myanmar has been gripped by street protests since the military seized control. At least 7 more people were killed by security forces on Thursday, taking the total death toll so far to more than 60. The military has dismissed criticism of its actions, instead placing the blame for the violence on Suu Kyi. It's victim blaming. As far as I can tell. Russia on Tuesday warned against pending action that U.S. officials say will take place in retaliation for the massive and ongoing hack into federal computer servers. This came after Secretary of State Antony Blinken and FBI Director Christopher Wray said that they are considering harsh punishments on Russia for the attack, including overt sanctions and some form of covert onslaught in the cyber realm. Russia denies the allegations but threatens retaliation in what can be viewed as the potential for a cyber war. I don't think we've really seen a full-on all-out cyber war, and frankly, I don't think we want to because of how many, not just of our devices, but again, this is the one that keeps getting brought up, the fact that our electrical grid is kind of deeply linked to the internet and can certainly be accessed and obstructed and breached by the internet. And I'm pretty sure that other countries' grids are the same thing too. I'm not trying to say, we pose a unique role of victimhood there potentially, but I'd be just, on this story in general, private intelligence has so far blamed Russia for the attack, SolarWinds attack specifically, which is what we're talking about here. But I haven't seen any public evidence on it. And what I learned from Russiagate last year was, or back in 2017, pardon me. What I learned from that was you don't really want to trust public officials coming out and blaming another country because often the evidence they're going on isn't all that great. And it's motivated reasoning where they have a party they want to blame and they're going to whichever groups allow them to blame that enemy. And it seems like we're doing the same thing again. But
also, just the ridiculousness of saying we're about to attack you. Like, how weird is that? Like, we're basically pointing a finger and saying that guy did it. Now, we're not providing any evidence to the public and everything else, but we're saying that guy did it. And fact of the matter is, with the hacking tools being released and everything else, we don't know that as a flat fact. And yet, we're about to launch, supposedly, an attack. And what do we expect? If Russia did it, or if they didn't do it, what do we expect them to do? Nothing? And does this escalate to the point of armaments and physical materiality? I mean, for God's sake. Like, it just seems so ludicrous on its face. We're going to attack Russia, and we're going to have a limited attack. Okay, what if they have a limited attack back? What do? Well, we have another limited attack. Okay, what if... This gets ridiculous after a while, right? I mean, I don't know, man. It just seems very bizarre that you announce that you're about to do an attack. It's very weird.
it does. It feels, yeah, it feels, I'm going to use the word performative again. It feels a bit performative. I'm going to throw in one more headline just because we're pushing time here. Poland and Hungary have challenged a budget mechanism at the European Union that would link payments to countries passing basic democratic standards such as judicial independence. Protesting the mechanism, titled the Rule of Law Compliance Initiative, Polish government spokesperson has said that disbursement of funds from the EU budget should, quote, be based only on meeting objective and concrete conditions, which unequivocally stem from regulations, quote unquote. And I'm guessing in the opinion of the Polish and Hungarian governments, both of which have been accused of lacking basic democratic standards, this new initiative would not be objective enough. It would be, more subjective, and it would leave in the hands of some independent, ruling process, maybe the parliament itself, whether or not these countries are passing those standards. And I think they're worried that, there's a bias going on there, but that's about what I know on that one. In any event, those are our headlines for now. We'll be back with 2 more batches of headlines, once at 8 and once at 9 a.m. Eastern this morning. We're going into a break. We'll be back in a minute with our soapbox segment, Jamarl's monologue, and a short conversation back and forth on that topic. Be right back on the other side of this break.
Fault lines.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones? With the historical context to tie them together, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you are consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. $7 trillion in wars. Let's start there. $7 trillion in wars. We had grotesque tax cuts in 2019 or 2018, whichever the year that was, that Donald Trump basically raised taxes on the poor. My wife and I had to pay more in taxes because of Donald Trump in that way, and gave grotesque tax cuts to the rich on top of the backs of the poor. Whew, that is breathtaking. And this was already at a time of grotesque income inequality. Under Obama, 95% of the income gains went to the top 1%. Under Trump, I suppose that number is probably going to be 100%, if not 99%. Obama enshrined 83% of the tax cuts into law. Bush grotesque tax cuts that were less grotesque than Trump's, but at the time considered to be the most grotesque tax cuts in the history of tax cuts. And yeah, we're talking about Bush also. When Wall Street crashed the economy, what happened? Obama stood there, strong man, cape in the back, saying, "I am the man standing between you and the pitchforks." And the crowd with the torches turned the other way and went back home, not wanting to pierce Obama, not realizing that Citigroup had basically chose the people who were going to be in Obama's cabinet, which basically means that those people were being screwed. Homeowners went bust. He wasn't standing there with his cape, protecting the homeowners. You could have even had a situation where the homeowners had been paid or had paid their homes off, where the banks could have got their money and the homeowners were also made whole. But you couldn't do that because of moral hazard. However, the moral hazard didn't necessarily apply to all of the money that you would give to those banks. Joe Biden runs and he says, "I am going to do XYZ." And one of the things he said he was going to do, with allusions to FDR, no deal. But one of the things he said he was going to do was a $15 an hour minimum wage. Joe Biden said that a starvation wage, anything less than 15 was a starvation wage. He said that to Donald Trump. Once he got into office, he said that as president, he said, my economic team and we've just had a conference. $15 an hour is the least. Anything below that is a starvation wage. And yet, didn't fight for it. Did he even believe it at all? And understand, Joe Biden was put into that office. Yes, you can make a case that say a lot of people put Biden into that office because he wasn't Trump. You can't say that for the Senate. You can't say that for the Senate. $1.9 trillion stimulus that passed is nice, but it is not a win. And don't get it twisted that it is not a win. What I mean by that is they put him in office for that diminutive agenda. And that diminutive agenda, despite having all powers necessary to pass that diminutive agenda, didn't pass it. Yes, that is not to take away from the items that are in that bill. I am making the point for the items that aren't. And the way and the dramatic change in people's lives that would have been affected by that $15 an hour. And I'm making the point that it wasn't in it, despite the fact that he had all the power to put it in it. That's why I'm saying this bill is not a win. You had tens of millions of people that would have been dramatically benefited. And by the way, the majority of those people were in the base of the Democratic Party, meaning black women. And you can even make a case that says Hispanic women, because imagine the number of people that are going to be benefited if $15 an hour went through. How many of those people would have been single mothers? How many of those people would have been African American single mothers? And by the way, International Women's Day yesterday. And on that day when they passed that, they triumphed that bill. And they will triumph that bill. Missing the fact that a large number of people, tens of millions, that would have been benefited, the number of people that would have been brought out of poverty, the number of mothers, single parent, that are working poor, that would have been elevated, would have been dramatic. That would have been a win. You had the House, the Senate, and the presidency. You could have pushed Kamala Harris to get to overrule the parliamentarian. You didn't do it. You could have gotten rid of the filibuster and passed your agenda. You didn't do it. You could have put a foot in Joe Manchin's behind in order to get him to get on board with that particular policy. You didn't do it. In one case after the next, when it was necessary to stand up for the American worker, you chose not to do it. That's the point that I'm trying to make here. It's not a win because you had all of the stuff that was given to you. You weren't fighting Republicans. Republicans were on acid. They were talking about Dr. Seuss and talking about Joe Biden's dog biting people. So it's not that. Those weren't the people you were negotiating with. You were negotiating with yourselves. And you came to the conclusion that the American worker wasn't worth $15 an hour. And to put it that much more succinctly, Joe Manchin and the Democrats in the Senate believed so fervently that the American worker wasn't worth $15 an hour, that they were willing to rip food out of the mouths of babies for another week just to make it that much more plain that we don't believe that you are worth $15 an hour. Why do I say that? Because basically, they could have accepted that bill with the $15 an hour. The president of the United States said he wanted it, right? If he said he wanted it, how are you going to go against the president of the United States? And why? 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 What justification do you have to be so mean-spirited that people who needed that check to be released as soon as possible have to wait another week just because you wanted to put a knife in the American worker? Why do you care so little about the American worker? You call them heroes. That's what you call them, heroes. When they were out there working for the COVID payments or COVID bills, they were putting their lives on the line day in and day out for us, for everybody else. Low wages, over and over, day after day. They had no idea whether their life was going to be the next one to go. 500,000 Americans lost their lives, and they could have been one of them. And the lion's share of that came from the poor, from the middle class, especially the people who didn't have the capability of going to an enclave, of being safe somewhere far away from the COVID disease. No, they had to be out there working day in and day out, and many of them for low wages. And instead of you backing up the American worker, instead of you saying, yes, we appreciate what you did, despite the fact that the government failed you monstrously, and the number of people that were infected and the number of deaths was a direct result of the government and the malfeasance of that government. And despite calling you heroes, I, Joe Biden, we, the Democratic Party, don't believe, experientially don't believe, you're worth $15 an hour. We had the power to do it. We just didn't do it. You didn't matter enough. The House of Representatives could have said, hey, we're going to put this $15 back in here because the president wants it. What the House knew is that the president didn't care all that much whether it was in the bill. If they did think that, they would have put it back in the bill. Here's the thing. The Senate has no greater jurisdiction to what is in the bill than the House. If the House puts it in and the Senate takes it out, the House has every bit of right, ethically, morally, philosophically, and again, since the president said he wanted it, practically, back in the bill. If the Senate wants to take it out, that's on the Senate. I'm making the point that the House can take a certain purview considering that the President of the United States said that was his point of view. But they didn't do that. They did theatrics, legislative virtue signaling, or the political equivalent of virtue signaling. Hey, everybody get on board and put your name to the $15 an hour. The Senate is against it? Oh, well, we tried. But hey, look at this big COVID bill we got for you. That's $1.9 trillion. Are you happy about that? Aren't you happy about that? And we can just manage the failure of the $15 an hour. No, this is not a win. You had all of the vices. And honestly, and just to close on this, you can make a case that the majority of the people who put Biden in office did so just because they wanted to get rid of Trump. You cannot make that case for the Senate. Ossoff, Warnock, that were the first Democrats that won in Georgia. And they won in Georgia because Joe Biden said, if you put me in, we'll enact my agenda. Part of that agenda was a $15 an hour minimum wage that Biden spent the year telling people he was going to do. And when it came down to it, he didn't believe it. The Democrats didn't push him to it. And at the end of the day, it means that they did not believe that the American worker was worth $15 an hour. Shane, what are your thoughts? Am I being too hard on Democrats here?
No, but I can't tell exactly whom you're addressing with this. If you're addressing Biden,
I'm addressing the entirety of the party because the entirety of the party made the choice. The House, the Senate, and the Supreme and the presidency, all of them basically made that choice that they weren't worth 15.
Well, here's the thing. Usually you've been addressing Biden, and admittedly, I would just see him sitting there glassy-eyed until about 5 minutes into your speech. You realized he'd had a stroke and had since passed. Sad to say that could happen. If you're addressing the entirety of the Democratic Party, that is an amorphous whole. Some of whom will agree with you, some of whom will simply try to ignore you, some of whom, if you had them trapped in a locked room, some of whom would still just refuse to admit any fault and quibble away whatever criticisms you could have of them. It is an amorphous group of people, and therefore it's hard for any one person to take responsibility and try to change. Now that could also be leveled against who I think you should be blaming, at least considering starting to blame, which is the people who voted Biden into office. If you don't like what Biden is doing, if he's a political player of mere positional value, if he's just a tool, like a pawn in chess or a rook in chess or whatever, if he's just a piece on the board who does not have any agency of his own, but is being steered by the collective demands of the Democratic Party and of the DC establishment, all this stuff as a whole, you got to blame the people who put him there. And it was voters who put him there. So I don't, again, that's also an amorphous whole, but at least some of them might be listening to us. At least they're more likely to be, in the audience than your average senator or representative, I guess.
I guess my thing is, yes, but let's say for the moment that the public gave the benefit of the doubt. Let's say they didn't know any better, to give the benefit of the doubt. Joe Biden went out there and told those people he was going to push for 15 an hour. He told those people, and the party said, and I'm talking about congressional Democrats here, it's very specific, The House puts 15 in a bill. The Senate takes it out. The House says, oh, well, Joe Biden doesn't do anything about it in order to push anybody in that process. And the House was living up to basically what the president wanted by not putting it back in. I mean, look, you can blame the public, and oftentimes I do. But in this very specific case, I'm pointing to the party and saying they basically said the public wasn't worth 15 an hour. And that's my case.
That's what politicians do. But that is literally that is practically the foremost definition of politics, at least in the United States, but I think it's around the globe. They make promises and then fail to fulfill them. And it turns out the promises they were making, they were just trying to get your votes. That's all that it was ever about. And it's rare that you find a politician that's an exception to that. And what people liked about Bernie specifically, not trying to speak on behalf of progressives here, but they got the sense that he was genuine about it and that he was doing more than that. So I don't give the benefit of the doubt. That's literally the thing that politicians are known for, first and foremost. And that extends to Biden. It extends across the Democratic Party. If the House is pushing for it and the Senate denies it, maybe that's just a performative front because they're trying to give a display to make it seem to the public like they're doing something about it.
Exactly.
Anyway, I'll hand it to you. I don't want to take over the conversation.
Well,
we
no,
got another
I guess
fascinating, interesting guest.
I guess the thing is, it's our job to ridicule them when they don't live up to their promises. That's all you can do. I mean, oftentimes I don't believe it. I didn't vote for Biden because I didn't believe it. By the same token, he did promise it. The Democratic Party did have the power to do it. This wasn't a situation where they were fighting Republicans. This was on them. And so when I make that argument that they didn't believe that America was worth $15 an hour, it seems that you agree with me in that argument. And I appreciate that, Shane. That's what it sounds like. I could be wrong. But you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment with Alexander Mercouris. This is going to be a very interesting conversation. You're going to love it. Back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. There was an interesting story. In fact, there's going to be a few stories that we talked with our guests about. But there was an interesting one that I came across yesterday that had me in stitches. And I have to admit, I can't even be mad at it. This is trolling on a peak level. And I'm saying trolling on a peak level that I haven't seen in a very long time. So the reporting is out that China is requiring some passengers who are arriving from overseas to basically receive an anal swab to test for COVID. Now, they've subjected American diplomats to this. They've subjected the Japanese to this. And they've basically argued with a straight face that traces of the virus may survive longer in the anus than in the respiratory tract, and that samples of the former may permit false negatives. Meaning, we need to be certain that you don't have it, even if it's clinging to your anus. We need to check back there. Now, they even make this argument, and I love it. This is propaganda at its best. They even make the point of saying, right here, he says, Lu Hushua, an infectious disease expert specialist in Fudan University in Shanghai, told state-controlled media Global Times tabloid that nasal or throat swabs could cause, quote, uncomfortable reactions, unquote, leading to subpar samples. He acknowledged that the fecal samples could replace anal swabs to prevent similar discomfort. I guess I'm making the point.
I think we might need a content. I think we might need a content warning just in case folks are eating their breakfast or something.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. My bad. This is content warning.
No, you're good.
Yeah, content warning, just so people will know. But I'm just making the point that this is an astonishing story. There is no reason that they would need to do this. This is trolling. I don't believe for a moment that this is a necessary process. To have a conversation about this and other stories, we're not going to linger on this one, but I do want to get his take on it. Alexander Mercouris. Alexander Mercouris is editor-in-chief at the Duran.com. Alexander, I don't know if you've seen this story, But this is trolling at a level that is astonishing. And I can't believe that the Chinese person will stay there with a straight face and be like, we need to check. We got to get check back there. We got to check back there. We need to be certain. We need to be 100% certain that you don't have anything before you step into this country. Alexander, are these guys trolling, or are they really that concerned about COVID?
No, they are trolling, and they are trolling, as you say, on an epic scale. And at this moment in time in history, only the Chinese feel powerful enough and self-confident enough to do it to the U.S. And the fact that they are doing it to the U.S. and to some other countries that they have difficult relations with, like Japan, is first a sign that it is trolling, and it is also a demonstration of Chinese power and self-confidence, because you see how muted the reaction from the United States and these countries has been. Imagine what the reaction would have been if it had been done in Russia. The Russians had done this to Western diplomats. There would have been a titanic row. The fact is that the West, for all its bluster, is intimidated by China in a way that at the moment they are not intimidated by Russia or by any other country anywhere on earth. It shows, it demonstrates to a striking degree how China's power is growing, how Chinese self-confidence is rising, how the Western powers are becoming increasingly unsettled by that rise. And of course, other countries around the world will be watching and taking note of this. And you can be absolutely sure that the diplomatic community in Beijing is absolutely buzzing with this story. They're all going to be talking to each other, in hushed and stunned tones. You can imagine diplomats from all sorts of countries, from Latin America and Africa and Asia and wherever, being utterly gleeful in private that it's actually happening, even though they're probably careful not to say so publicly. And, of course, other countries around the world are going to take courage from this, because they will show that you can actually humiliate the diplomats of these powerful Western countries in that kind of way. And if you're China, you can do it. And perhaps that gives you an example that you can do it too. And it also shows you how strong China is, and that China now is an alternative, is becoming a real alternative to the West. So yes, it's trolling. It's extremely clever trolling. And I would point out that it is happening at one and the same time that the Chinese have just announced that they are agreeing with the Russians a joint moon program with the intention of setting up a lunar base, a permanent lunar base with the Russians on the moon, a further demonstration to the world of the strength of the strategic partnership between these two countries. So a fascinating and extraordinary event, and one which perhaps is ultimately more important than the rather comical nature of it might imply.
Oh, 1,000%.
And that was just this Tuesday. Just very exciting move, like we were talking about that yesterday on another show. Very, very exciting move for China and Russia to announce that. Switching for a moment to the other counterpart in that deal, and I wonder how this would fit into what you were just saying about the U.S. and other Western powers being intimidated by China. We are threatening. It's either a warning or a threat, which of course, but one is sort of a euphemism for the other at a certain point. Threatening cyber war against Russia in retaliation, first and foremost, for an attack that we blamed on Russia, the Solar Winds attack breach, which in addition to breaching, many government agencies, also was a breach simply for companies that were using the service provided by this company. As far as I can tell, publicly, we have not seen proof that this attack has been linked to China. To Russia. It has up till now, remained the reserve of private intelligence and maybe the purview of some private companies working with private intelligence. But regardless, on the larger point of cyber war, I've got two ways I'm looking at this, and I want to go back to one of Jamarl's points as well. For one thing, like Jamarl said earlier in the show, it is bizarre that we are announcing, sort of pre-declaring a potential cyber war. It's weirdly showing your hand in a way that feels like we're performing in some sense to me. It doesn't feel like we're preparing for an actual war. It feels like we are setting up for something else. But additionally, like you said, we are probably intimidated by China. We've blamed many recent hacking breaches on China as well, yet we're not preparing for or preparing to declare cyber war on China. We're doing that on Russia, of course. And then I guess a little bit more deeply, do you place any merit on the claims that Russia was responsible for this? And how would you fear and how would you feel about a cyber war if it were to come? Because as far as I can tell, we have not yet seen one of those on the global stage. Alexander, what's your take?
No, we haven't. And I think if it were to happen, we don't know what the effects would be, but it's easy to imagine that they might be very severe indeed. What I'm going to say is this. I don't know who carried out the SolarWinds hack. I don't see that there's any actual evidence that it was Russia. There's been speculation from the intelligence community that it was Russia. But if you actually drill through their statements, it's pretty clear that this is speculation rather than absolute concrete certainty. They're guessing it was most likely Russia, but they don't know. And of course, what I would say about that is that, of course, if it was Russia, well, they've got the capabilities to do it. But of course, it looks like it was a classic case of espionage. Espionage is done by every country, and I don't really see why the severity of the American reaction to this, how that's disproportionate to what actually happened. But we're going to go back to this whole cyber war thing. Firstly, let's just take a step back and think how bizarre the American threats and actions firstly are. Firstly, they're going to take action. They're going to take this very aggressive step, or so they say, against Russia, even though they don't in fact know for a fact that it was Russia that was responsible for the SolarWinds scandal. Secondly, they're saying that this is going to be an incredibly secret, invisible operation that the outside world won't know about. And thirdly, they then publicly announce this incredibly secret, invisible operation 3 weeks before they say it's going to take place. I mean, it is quite ludicrous that you announce a secret cyber attack like this 3 weeks in advance in the New York Times. Now, two things to say. I understand that in Russia internally, there has been a very negative reaction to this. That's completely unsurprising. The Russian government has taken a very strong line about it. They said that this would amount to a kind of terrorism incident. And it seems Russian public opinion and the Russian media are full of this story. And there are many, many angry people in Russia who are talking about this. And I've actually heard comments from Russians. They've actually been contacting me, and they're saying to me how angry they feel about it also, and that they see this as a direct threat to their own country. And there's been increasing calls for Russia not to take this line down, but to escalate. If we do get into a cycle of escalation, I have absolutely no doubt that the Russians have a very sophisticated cyber capability of their own. Who knows how far this can go? We saw with the Stuxnet virus that was inserted 10 plus years ago, actually longer ago than that in Iran, that these things can be disruptive and can be dangerous. But Russia is on an entirely different level of sophistication from in Iran. The Kaspersky lab in Moscow is one of the most advanced antivirus labs in the world, and that's a commercial operation. So who knows what secret tools the Russians have. And of course, we don't know what secret tools the Americans have, and we don't know what secret tools the Chinese have. There is no regulation, no international agreements about these sort of cyber warfare things. If they are as dangerous as people think, then we urgently need internationally to agree some sort of rules about how these weapons should be used. The Russians and the Chinese have repeatedly proposed them. It is the United States which has consistently refused to negotiate any restrictions on its use of cyber weapons. The United States is far more dependent on these sort of electronic things in its economy than Russia is or China is. I suspect that China especially has much more resiliency in its systems than the United States does. I'm sure that the Russians are going to take away from this that they need to build up resiliency. Also, I can very easily see how before very long the United States could find itself at a severe disadvantage unless it negotiates controls over these sort of things
internationally. And it's bizarre to me. We got to close to go to a break here, and then we'll bring it back. But it is bizarre to me, considering what you're saying, and I believe that you're right. Our infrastructure, the aspects of whether it's our energy infrastructure or our military or simply the mechanisms of governance, seem to be a lot more susceptible to these attacks based on all of the alleged hacking attempts over the past at least half decade, although it stretches a bit more than that. So you're right. Another way to frame this is, it is bizarre that we have not pushed for regulations more, since we after all apparently have more to lose from the lack of regulations. But we've got to go to a break. We're joined by Alexander Mercouris. He is editor-in-chief at theduran.com, and you can follow his work with the Duran on Twitter at theduran_com, also the Duran on YouTube and on their website, theduran.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
You check top.
We couldn't put it better ourselves. Tune in to Political Misfits on Mondays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Miss the Press, our weekly takedown of Sunday's toothless news talk shows.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are joined by Alexander Mercouris, the editor-in-chief at theduran.com. I want to correct something, because we spoke about this a while back, and I wasn't sure if it had gotten updated. We need to update our bio for you. But the Duran's Twitter account is still suspended. Is that correct, Mr. Mercouris?
We've given up on it. We're not making any attempt to revive it. We've decided we don't need Twitter, and frankly, it's too much trouble. So that's where we are. But you can still find us if you look us up on YouTube. That's where we do most of our work now. So if you just put the Duran into the YouTube search, you will find us there.
Well, you don't need Twitter, and Twitter does not deserve you. I'm sorry to hear that you've given up on it, but I can't.
That's exactly the philosophy we've taken. We haven't
yes.
any change in our traffic as a result of giving up on Twitter. So we're very relaxed about that. We feel very comfortable having done away with Twitter, and we don't have one thing less to worry about, frankly.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. I'm permanently changing our bio. And again, I think a good move on your part. Let's reposition slightly. We're having a very interesting conversation about the prospect of a cyber war between Russia and the United States, or possibly a global world cyber war. But let's move to Spain for a minute, and specifically the story of three Catalan separatists, namely the leader, as far as I can tell, of the Catalan separatist movement, Carles Puigdemont. They're currently in Belgium. They had diplomatic immunity after an attempt to get separatism pushed through for the region in a referendum. That referendum was declared illegal by the Spanish government. They've been in Belgium with diplomatic immunity for a while as the Spanish government tries to extradite and arrest them. The European Parliament has just moved to revoke that diplomatic immunity, basically leaving the case of extradition in Belgian hands. I guess a couple of ways we can approach this. For one thing, Alexander, how significant of a diplomatic and political event in the European Union do you see this being? And then two, how do you think the Belgian government is going to respond? Will they give extradition to Spain? Will they choose to remain a place for asylum for these individuals? How do you see them handling this, Alexander?
I think this is a big event, actually, and I think it is very indicative of the European Union's attitudes, because, of course, the European Union is very keen and anxious to set itself up as the great judge and jury around the world of how countries and governments misbehave. And, of course, it routinely, regularly lectures other countries about how they should behave. I mean, the British are now doing it about China, talking about China before. The Chinese are furious about some comments that the Europeans have been making about China. And, of course, we had the disastrous trip a few weeks ago of the EU's High Representative Josep Borrell to Moscow, where he tried to lecture the Russians about Navalny and got basically shown the door. Now, what has happened is that the European Union, for all its high words about not allowing the political persecution of people, or at least the persecution of people who have taken political acts, through one of its major institutions, the European Parliament, has stripped the people in question, these MPs in question, of their political immunity. So it shows yet again that the European Union says, do as we say, not as we do. If Spain wants to imprison people on political charges, Spain is a member of the European Union, and that is fine. If Russia does it, or China does it, or what we say are political charges, well, that is terrible, and you must be on the receiving end of lectures about us from it and of sanctions if you don't do as we want. It shows how divided, how inconsistent the EU has become about this, and it also shows, by the way, how committed the European Union is to holding every part of the European Union together and holding the various states of the European Union together, and how insecure ultimately it feels. Now, turning to Belgium, I predict that there will be a great deal of toing and froing within the Belgian legal system over the extradition of these three MPs, including, of course, Carlos Puigdemont. Up to now, the Belgian courts have been very reluctant to extradite Catalan independence politicians to Spain, precisely because they tend to see these requests for extradition from Spain as being requests to extradite people on political charges. So the Belgian courts may refuse, but it's very interesting that the Belgian courts see these as political charges and the European Union itself doesn't. And that tells you a great deal about the European Union at this time.
I want to take a slight detour. I mean, still in Europe. In fact, I'm divided on this question because I think there's two questions. But the first one in Europe on Nord Stream 2. So I've developed a liking of watching press briefings. It's a weird quirk that I've developed. Ned Price comes out on Nord Stream 2. He says the following. He says, I would say that as a general matter, we don't comment on communications with the Hill. What we can say is the administration's focus and our efforts remain the same, and that is preventing the completion of Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Now, this seems to be an issue or factor for Europe or for Germany specifically. And yet, the United States is seemingly hell-bent on preventing Germany from getting this gas or this oil from Russia. This is very bizarre to me that Europe is okay with this. And more importantly, how does Germany justify any kind of, animosity against Russia when it's perfectly willing to get the oil from Russia? I mean, it's not like the U.S. doesn't have a point. By the same token, the U.S. shouldn't have any say-so in where Germany gets its oil. But it is an interesting point to make of saying, well, wait a minute, if these guys are that much of a threat where you need to be a part of this kind of military organization, then why is it okay for you to get your gas? Alexander, what's your purview on that, your point of view on that? I just always thought it was a weird quirk.
Identified all the key points. Firstly, the fact that the Germans are pressing ahead with Nord Stream 2, and they're completely committed to it, and the German business community is solidly in support of it. What that shows is that the Germans do not really believe there is any threat to them from Russia. On the contrary, the German business community at the moment is very keen to reopen its economic links with Russia. Germany's economic trading links with Britain are not, which were very important, are closing down. So Germany remains for them an important market, and of course it's also, in a sense, a place which the Germans see as very, very important to develop trading links with, because that's the future, in effect, of the German economy, building close economic links with the great neighbor to the east. So the Germans are intent on going forward with it. They don't really see a threat from Russia. The United States comes along and says, look, you can't do this. You must stop. We don't like Nord Stream 2, and we are threatening all sorts of sanctions. What this has done, actually, is that it's brought home to many people in Germany what a difficult partner, and of course Germans still like to think of the US as a partner, what a difficult partner the US is. Because the US obviously has some great geopolitical quarrel with Russia, but it is now one which is being pursued in a way which is cutting against Germany's vital economic interests. And even though the Germans were very pleased when the Biden administration replaced the Trump administration, I think they have been dismayed by the way in which the Biden administration has persisted in this hostility to Nord Stream 2. I think they were hoping they could persuade the US, the Biden administration, to relent. And that has made them question the relationship with the US even further. I have to say, my own opinion is that the tide of opinion in Germany is actually starting to shift. And more people in Germany are starting to come round to the view that this close relationship with the US, for having been a major guarantee and protection and asset during the Cold War and during the post-Cold War period, is now starting to become a liability. So I predict we will see Nord Stream 2 finished. I predict the Germans will dig in their heels. I predict the Biden administration will not, in the end, press the button of sanctions against Germany itself to stop Nord Stream 2 being completed. But in the process, there's been a lot of damage done to the US's relationship with Germany, and that will be a permanent thing.
And another interesting aspect of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and of what the situation that you're presenting in general is, I'll put it like this. Europe has a couple of major qualms, at least on the surface, with Russia. From what they've said, most recently it's been focused on Navalny and over Russia's treatment of Alexei Navalny. But a sort of deeper, lingering stated concern here is that Russia is constantly poised to invade the Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia. I can't help but think that Germany, which as an economic powerhouse in the European Union is providing the bread and butter of economic support for all of the EU's policies and just the stability of the union as a whole. I can't help but think that they wouldn't go through with the Nord Stream 2. They wouldn't go through with the pipeline if they thought that Russia was actually on the brink of those invasions. Does that make sense, Alexander? In other words, by choosing to go through with that process in the long term, it's invalidating one of the major premises of NATO's pushback on Russia in the region. What's your take?
You're completely right. I mean, it entirely contradicts it. I mean, the Germans do not perceive a threat from Russia. They don't believe that the Russians are about to invade the Baltic states. They don't see the Russians as any kind of a long-term or medium-term or short-term military or political threat. The German business community sees Russia as a gigantic opportunity to forge forward with major economic relations. They are becoming increasingly alarmed by the fact that they are losing positions in Russia to the Chinese, who have now overtaken them as Russia's major economic and trading partner. And they are not going to, they're very unhappy, and they're going to resist any attempt to impose further sanctions on Russia, which will get in the way of that. And they're determined.
Alexander, let's close it here because we're out of time. We're coming up to the end of this hour. I want to thank you again for joining us for these great conversations. For those listening, Alexander Mercouris is editor-in-chief at theduran.com. You can follow his work with the Duran on YouTube and on their website, theduran.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a minute with headlines.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe, welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am your ever-vigilant, indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And that would mean you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines.
I'm sorry. I want to make a quick comment.
Go for it.
This is part of your intro. You switched over to doing it, and I like it. Precipitously perched on the edge of this, resilient but exploited globe. The resilient but exploited globe part. It kind of reminds me of, like, say you're an abusive partner, and I don't want to say that. I'm not actually saying that because that's not a good thing to be. Say you're an abusive partner, and your spouse has big bones, has like a resilient bodily structure. Does that justify the physical abuse? Does that justify beating them? That kind of reminds that's the sort of analogy that comes to mind when thinking about how we treat our planet. Just because it can take it, as far as we can tell, does that mean that we should continue to exploit it? And of course, the answer in both cases is no. And I think in that sense, it's a valid analogy.
Yeah, just because a thing exists doesn't mean you have a right to that thing. Meaning the integrity of that thing is the integrity of that thing. There's nothing cosmic that gives you a right to do X or Y to. You just take the right. This is why when the conversation with Alexander Mercouris, I wanted to get into this notion about regulations. Regulations don't matter. International laws don't matter. There is no such thing as international law. And the only time a country would ever get into a regulation is if that country believes it can't win. Meaning, if it believes on some level that it has some kind of advantage, getting into some kind of, let's say, regulation or some kind of treaty limits the advantage of that particular country because that country is basically hitting a plateau when really the plateau is self-imposed. I hope that does that make sense? Like John Bolton was famous for being against treaties because in his head, well, we have the economy, we have the political structure, we have the military. Yeah. Why would we get into a treaty that is going to somehow limit our capabilities if we needed to basically attack an enemy? It's the law of the jungle. And in this case, why would we limit our weapons? It's that. And there's also a secondary element that Britain had to deal with this kind of upper lip thing, where the moment that America becomes a superpower and considers itself the indispensable nation, then every leader that comes in, even members of members of Congress, has that point of view. And unfortunately, that point of view means that when it's looking out at the world, if it's a nation that it doesn't consider a peer, even if that nation is better than us on some level, we will not accept it, nor will we enter into a treaty with that nation if it believes, or if we believe it will make us look weak. The treaty thing is very, I get it, because I always think if you have the ability to have, let's say, a treaty for weapons in space, why not a treaty for weapons on Earth? Why not a treaty to get rid of all the weapons on Earth? Why not a treaty just for peace? And it's like, well, no, because the space thing costs so much money. Down here on the ground, we believe we have an advantage already, and that instantiated advantage is not going to be given up by any kind of weapons treaties on the ground, unless it's something where we think we can't win. I could be wrong, and that's cynical, but I do think that's more right than not, especially if you look at our world. All right, let's do headlines. I'm sorry. Shane, that's your fault. I'm blaming you, Shane. I'm blaming you. I'm joking. At least 1,477 new coronavirus deaths and 58,530 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there's been an average of 57,400 cases per day. That's a decrease of 16% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of this morning, more than 29,247,000 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and just under 529,000 have died from it. The majority of those people, of course, are probably American workers. And Democrats have just told those American workers that despite you dying in these large numbers, despite it being the fault of that same government, that you are not worth $15 an hour. We can drop, 40 bombs a day for 40 years. But no, you are not worth $15 an hour. City officials predicted Wednesday that all New Yorkers would be eligible to get the coveted COVID-19 vaccine before the end of spring. Currently, between 4 and 5 million New Yorkers are eligible to get the vaccine. Dr. J. Varma, de Blasio's senior advisor for public health, went on to say, quote, "We want to be in a situation where vaccine supply exceeds demand," unquote. Yeah, exactly. And by the way, I think I made the choice to get the vaccine, Shane. I think I'm going to get it. The more I think about it, I can't come... I guess when I used to be younger, I used to be against taking pain meds. I used to be like, oh, just take the pain, just take the pain. I don't need to do it. And somewhere along the way, I was like, why am I doing that? What's the point of me doing that? Is there a marginal difference, or is there a huge difference in me taking the pain meds versus not taking the pain meds that's going to have some kind of consequence that goes beyond the marginal? And at that point, I thought it was utterly ridiculous. It was ideology, as opposed to, just dealing with reality as the way reality is. And yeah, I'm thinking this is kind of the same frame of mind. What's the negative? I mean, for God's sake, I spent 20 years dealing with kidney issues. I've just had a stroke last year. And it's like, what do I expect to take place that's going to be larger than those issues? And I got to be honest, is there a probability of chance? Yes. Is that probability of chance enough for me to not get it? I don't think so. So I am leaning more towards the side of get it as opposed to not. Not to mention, to get back into the office, I'm probably going to need one. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton on Wednesday threatened to sue the city of Austin for choosing to keep its COVID mask mandate for businesses in place. The Attorney General accused Austin of not complying with Governor Greg Abbott's recent executive order, which extended a statewide mask mandate and banned coronavirus restrictions on businesses. The governor's order has, quote, has the force and effect of state law and supersedes local rules and regulations, unquote. In a letter to Austin Mayor Steve Adler, Travis County Judge Andy Brown, quote, "You and local health authorities have until 6 p.m. today to rescind any mask mandates or business operating restrictions and come into full compliance with Georgia 34, unquote," Paxton wrote on Twitter. Otherwise, on behalf of state of Texas, I will sue you. He followed the threat with a taunt, writing, quote, "City, county leaders must not be thinking clearly. Maybe it's the oxygen deprivation from the quintuple masking," unquote. That's real funny. That's real funny. That's hilarious, considering you're about to get people killed with that mask or removing the mask mandate. Denmark has put its use of Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine on hold on reports that people have received it have developed blood clots after one person died from a clot after receiving the shot. They're still trying to understand whether it's the link between the vaccine and the clotting. They don't know. They're trying to validate the results, or trying to validate whether it's true beyond the reports. Minnesota Supreme Court denied the appeal from ex-Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin Wednesday. After the state Supreme Court's decision, District Judge Peter Cahill could reinstate third-degree murder charge. By the end of the day Wednesday, jury selection had seated 5 jurors. The case will need 14 altogether, 12 for deliberations and 2 alternates. The court will reconvene at 8 a.m. Central Time on Thursday, when Cahill will address the third-degree murder charge issue before resuming the selection process. Thomas Lane J. Alexander Kung and Tao Teo face charges of aiding and abetting and manslaughter. Now, these were the officers, if I'm not mistaken, that were with Chauvin while he was in the process of casually murdering Floyd. I mean, for God's sake, it took 9 minutes. And at some point in the 9 minutes, you would think that the officers would have said, hey, that guy's not moving. And more importantly than that guy's not moving, when that guy said he can't breathe, and that guy started calling his mom, then maybe that guy is at a point where we actually need to give that guy medical attention, because contrary to popular belief, that cop is not there to kill that guy. That cop is there to apprehend that guy with the least amount of force necessary. He is working, supposedly, ideally, philosophically, for us. And just because we, talking about the American public, may be having a bad day, it doesn't necessarily mean that they need to use maximum justice at every infringement of the law. The $20 bill didn't necessitate that. Meaning, your ability to subdue the person doesn't necessarily need to go into the punitive direction. And if it does get to the point where it looks punitive, if it does get to the point where you're ignoring that person's pleas for breath or ignoring that person's life in general, then yeah, you should be prosecuted for that. If we do something that run afoul of the law and get somebody killed, even by accident, we will be prosecuted viciously. And I'm making the point that the cop, with all the responsibilities and all the powers that are endowed in that cop, with great power comes great responsibility. And the law should follow suit and hold them accountable, even that much more so because of the power that they're endowed. And it seems like it's the opposite. The Senate on Wednesday confirmed Michael S. Regan, the former top environmental regulator for North Carolina, to lead the Environmental Protection Agency. Mr. Reagan's mission will be putting forward aggressive, quote-unquote, new regulations to meet President Biden's pledge of eliminating fossil fuel emissions from the electrical power sector by 2035, significantly reducing emissions for automobiles and preparing the United States to emit no net carbon pollution by the middle of the century. Two things. A, that's too late. And three things. B, the environment is a real thing, unlike money. And because the environment is a real thing, and we live on this particular environment, we have a habitable space that we need to ensure that we maintain. If that habitable space gets to the point where something gets out of whack because we are pushing stuff into our atmosphere, we will suffer for that. We have suffered for that. And we've seen that from the standpoint of storms. We've seen that from the standpoint of the degradation in the nutrients in our food because of the amount of carbon we put into the sky. Yeah, we're seeing the consequences for that. I'm just making the point that how do we know? With what we know of Biden and the promises that he makes, $15 an hour minimum wage, you can say it for a year and not back that promise up. How do we know that Biden is ever really going to push for this, ever even really meant this? And if there's even a whiff of opposition, we'll fall over. Just saying, yeah, I'm bitter. $15 an hour is a big deal. My mom was one of those people that worked the entirety of her life making less than $15 an hour. Think about what that means. Single parent, didn't have the other dad around in order to help with that situation. She was doing it all by herself. If there's a parking ticket, that is a disaster. If it's a speeding ticket, that is a disaster. If there's a school trip, it is a disaster. And I'm making the point that it would have been life-changing for her to make $11 an hour and for it to go to $15. Life-changing. And she is not the only person in this country like that. She voted Democrat her entire life. And you have a party that doesn't stand behind black women, or for that matter, women in general, on International Women's Day to ensure that that thing got over the finish line. Yeah, I'm bitter, and I should be bitter about it. And the American public and the American worker and anybody making less than $15 an hour should be apoplectic over what took place. They're going to manage your perceptions when they pass that COVID relief bill. And they're trying to make the argument that, hey, the COVID bill passed, don't pay attention to the $15 an hour because the COVID bill passed, and let's triumph that. No, I'm not going to triumph that because there's millions of people that have just been shafted, and they should feel some kind of way about the fact that they got shafted. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking the COVID relief bill, put in the rosiest of terms, called the American Rescue Plan by the Biden administration, but I'll just call it the COVID relief bill for now. talking about a couple of specific proposals from an economic perspective with our next guest, Mark Frost. He's an economist, a professor, a consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, a capitalist, a Schumpeterian, and a recovering libertarian. Mark, one quick thing I'm noticing, we are not billing you as a business owner. And from what you've told us, and from what we know, based on what you've told us, you are a business owner. You've worked in pretty prominent, it was like how ATMs work and process money. Is that right, Mark?
The last 20 years was in the ATM industry, and right now I run a payments company. So yeah, I'm primarily an entrepreneur, and I do the academic thing on the side, basically. So I'm a businessman.
I think we should add that to your bio. I think that helps a bit. And it's admittedly there are already a bunch of commas in that bio, but I think it's important enough to add one more. I'll get right on that a little bit later. Anyway, let's talk about the COVID relief bill that the House has just passed. Specifically, I think we should focus on two main proposals before moving either this segment or next one to another proposal that wasn't in the bill, namely the $15 minimum wage. But first, let's talk about the $1,400 checks getting rolled out, as well as the $300 a month child tax credit. Now, from your previous appearances on the show, you were calling for much more than $1,400 or the grand total of $4,000 that we would, you can add up over the last three of these checks that have been rolled out, including this one. You were calling like for tens of thousands of dollars, and I believe the argument you were making. Well, just go ahead and make it for us. Why are you, a recovering libertarian, arguing that much more money should have been rolled out in response to this crisis than has been so far, Mark?
Sure. First of all, good morning. When I say more money, I don't necessarily mean more total money. I mean, for most people, for most regular, normal people, $600 does nothing to change their behavior. I'll say that again, just for dramatic, emphasis. For normal people, giving them $600 doesn't change their behavior. Now, that's what I said for normal people, under the sweet spot of the bell curve. They're neither really rich, they're neither really poor. So my argument was always, if the goal is a stimulus bill, if that's really the goal, you want to stimulate macroeconomic processes and accelerate them. If that's really what your goal is, then you want to get money into the hands of people that will spend it. Now, this inevitably is going to have some pork in it, because pork is all about appropriating some money and then having it spent. And I've been pretty consistent on this in the sense that, basically speaking, I think that anybody, what am I trying to say? I lost my train of thought there. Sorry about that.
You're good. Well, here's the thing. One of the more interesting arguments that I've heard you making on this before is effectively, due to the lockdowns, a lot of people have lost a lot of money. A lot of people who are working regular jobs, unless you're an essential worker, especially early in the lockdown, that stuff has gotten shut down. And for a lot of folks, it has continued to be shut down. And so if I remember correctly, the argument went something like the government, by mandate, took economic opportunities away from people, and therefore they owe them some recompense. They owe them on the order of more than $4,000, closer to tens of thousands of dollars on a sort of, case-specific basis. But still, if you look at a lot of people, they were in that position. Does that still ring true for you, Mark?
Yes, it does, because I don't think you can shut somebody's business down with, in a free society at least, without some form of compensation. I mean, you don't just get to go in and play dictator and say, okay, your business is closed and deal with it. That sort of a thing. So that's more on kind of a philosophical perspective. But from an economics perspective, if you want to stimulate the economy, you have to get money into the hands of people with a very high marginal propensity to consume, because you don't want to give it to the people who will save it, or people who will spend it on Bitcoin or whatever else they're going to do. You want to give money to people that it will help, and who will take that money and go spend it. And that's the problem I've had in the past. Giving somebody that makes $125,000 a year $1,200 seems silly if the goal is to help people who are really struggling. So let's take an example. Let's say you have a waitress, 35 years old, and she has 2 kids, and she makes, normally with tips, she makes $45,000 a year. All of a sudden, her job is taken away, no tips anymore. Even the small little paycheck doesn't come in. That woman needs a lot more than $1,200. She needs $10,000 to $15,000 over the year at a minimum. I mean, this is at a minimum. And what I find is we waste so much money in these appropriation bills. It drives economists crazy. They call them names that have nothing really to do with what they're actually doing. Most of this bill is not a COVID relief bill. This is a spoils of war bill, and it probably happens every election, but this one was a really big one because there was a bigger opportunity.
Mark, even been a bigger opportunity. It's funny. You're sounding a bit like me on this one. I guess, well, I guess I look at it in similar terms. I mean, this was the fault of the government of the United States. And this is kind of like the reparations question to me. Like, where people would say, well, I mean, there's not a vampire that was living all of that time back then where you can kind of take money out of the guy's pocket. But the government of the United States back then basically implemented, allowed, and legalized slavery. So the responsibility for that is the government, not any individual one person. I make the point that the same thing is true here. The government of the United States shut down business. I mean, 30-40% of businesses went belly up as a result of government shutting down. And I understand why. So I don't even have an issue with them doing it. My issue is that you don't pay recompense or, for that matter, help sustain those businesses. I mean, the majority of the money that went for the PPP ended up in the hands of companies that didn't need the money, shouldn't have gotten the money in the first place. And so now you have all of these businesses went belly up, all of these people who had lost their jobs, healthcare going along with it. Many of them were single parents, or like you said, restaurants or some of these businesses where the people weren't making much in the beginning, despite we calling them heroes. I mean, I feel that people should be apoplectic over this, because even though they're going to chest thump for the COVID bill, it's not enough. And when it gets to like the $15 an hour minimum wage, yeah, it's not enough. I feel like they shafted the American public on some level, despite the fact that they're passing this bill. I mean, am I being too harsh on Democrats on this? I mean, or is there another way to look at this? Or am I hitting it at an angle where you say, yeah, I agree with your ends, but not necessarily your thinking process? I just think when you lose 500 to 25,000 people as a result of malfeasance by the government of the United States, there should be compensation, period. And it doesn't seem like they're on the same page. They're up to business as usual. What are your thoughts, Mark?
They're somewhat similar. Being libertarian-ish, I'm skeptical of government anyway. Let's be more specific. There are things that my faith that government can go solve this problem is very limited. So I tend to see free market solutions with respect to the generation of money. And then you take that money that's been made by people and you say, okay, these people have benefited from this capitalist system. We're going to redistribute a little bit of it and redirect some of this to create a better society. That's most libertarians read Hayek, and Hayek made a big deal out of having you can call it whatever you want. He called it negative income tax, but it's basically universal basic income. I like that idea in a primarily urban, highly technological, advanced civilization. It seems to make sense. Statistically, in an urban environment where everybody sells their labor, they sell their time to other people. When you have a situation like that, you have to have a way to catch people that fall through, because everybody's going to fall through from time to time, generally speaking, in a situation like that. So I like the idea of, I would get rid of all of the federal government programs and have an instantaneous negative income tax, meaning you lose your job, you don't have to worry about applying for unemployment because you're going to get a government check immediately because you lost your job. And, there'll be fine print on this and that sort of a thing.
I just want to interject briefly. Before basic
wages and things like that.
Before universal basic income was a major theme in American politics, specifically before Andrew Yang brought it to the forefront. When I first heard about it, talk about it was coming out of Silicon Valley libertarians who were advocating for exactly that, basically replacing a lot of federal welfare programs with the universal basic basic income, with the idea that you got these large, they would say bloated organizations you can simply replace with, a sort of minimum quantity of money that everybody can expect to get. And that, it will do the work of it. You'll reduce government spending on the one hand, you'll make up for it on the other. But in the process, everybody will be left simpler. Now, that gets admittedly controversial when you bring the idea of the universal basic income out on the national stage. And a lot of people who are currently dependent on those welfare programs are like, hey, slow down a minute. I'm not sure if this is going to work as well as you think it will. And then, of course, there are specific cases where certain people might exceptionally benefit from certain programs, and they wouldn't be able to make it up if they got the universal basic income. But that's almost beside the point. I want to come back because we've only got a few minutes left in this segment. I want to come back to the relief bill and specifically the $300 child tax credit. I'll just pass it right over to you, Mark. What do you think about that? Is that too much? Is that not enough? Should it be extended past this first year? What's your take on it generally, Mark?
It's meaningless because, again, if $300 makes a big difference in your life right now, you have problems beyond COVID. And I'm serious. Just do a thought experiment. And I've been there. I've been there to where $300 would change my life.
Same here.
I had severe emotional, mental problems at that time. So there is another story besides just somebody's poor. There's a difference between being poor and struggling and being destitute. Generally speaking, when people are destitute, there's something else going on in their life that's driving that.
Well, wait, that's too far.
Sorry.
No, I'm sorry, Mark. Sorry. I didn't mean to intervene. I'm sorry. Go. Please finish.
Oh, that's fine. I was pretty much done.
I just think that's too strong. I mean, to say that $300, if a person needs $300, or if a person is in a situation where $300 changes the situation of their life, that there's something else going on. I don't entirely know if that's true, especially considering it depends on what you mean by something else going on. Like my mom.
Just to be clear, this is not a total payment. This would be on a month-by-month basis. I don't mean to interject too much, but $300 a month, I could see that making a lot of difference.
That's a big difference. I'm telling you, it's a big difference. I mean, say for example, I remember when I first started working.
I thought you were talking about 300 transfer, one-time transfer.
No. He has a.
No. This would be.
Yeah, it's a month.
A child tax credit, and it's per month, but it would expire at the end of this year. It's a temporary measure. No, it's a big difference there.
Well, $300 a month is better than $300 a year. But again, my argument is some of the people that are going to receive this don't need it at all. Other people that will be receiving this need a lot more. And I don't know why there is a resistance. It seems to be among Republicans too, to means test this thing, and to mean test it hard. What we want to do is to keep poor people from becoming destitute. That's what we want to do in part, right? We want to keep poor people from becoming destitute. We want them to retain hope. We also want to stimulate the economy. And a great way to do that is to help poor people because they'll go spend the money. They won't save it. That's the critical issue in macroeconomic stimulus. Will they save it or will they spend it? In the 2008 bailouts, we already know what happened. For the most part, all that stimulus to the banks just sold it and bought other banks and invested in their own infrastructure. They didn't really do any changes that would help the economy or help the society.
No, they just quote unquote, consolidated their position or whatever, consolidated the existence of these companies on Wall Street, like you're saying, by buying up other companies. Frankly, I agree with means testing. And the classic response to means testing is that different people in different cases will need, if you're doing a simple means testing based on income, simply, if you're living in New York City, you're going to need a much higher income just to maintain basic standard of living compared to if you're living in, any random rural town in the Midwest or the South, et cetera. But I guess there's one, if you add one additional qualification, if it's means testing on income compared to like an index of the cost of living in your county, for instance. So you can have a very simple index. This is the cost of living in New York City versus the cost of living in Asheville, North Carolina, or Austin, Texas, whatever. I'm naming random towns that come to mind, all of them hipster for some reason. But still, the point being, if you add in that one simple qualification, that seems to largely take care of the problem. I guess Mark, Jamarl, I'm open. We got to go to break here real quick. But any quick comments?
I'm not against universal programs. Like, I'm not against universal public school. I'm not against Social Security being universal. And even for this particular program, I don't necessarily have a big deal with it. But I do agree with Mark that if the specific intent is to boost the economy, then yeah, you give it to the people who need it. And the catch, and I guess at that point, the fight is who are the people that need it and what that number is. I'm always dodgy with those, or I'm always skeptical of that. Only because at a certain point, it's used to put a program and pretend like the program is doing something, while simultaneously, when you look behind the scenes, the program has basically limited so many people from it that it's almost not doing the job. Like, for example, yes, we're going to allow kids to go to school, state institutions for free. Here's the fine print. And then the fine print, it's like kids with one leg, with a parent with one arm, that came from this particular place, that, you know, went on a spiritual quest in Himalayas, and that kid can make it and don't have to pay for the books. You know, it's that. And that's where my skepticism comes in on that. But if it's done correctly, yeah, I guess I can get behind something like that. And like you said, at that point, it's just the number. But let's do this. Mark, we're going to bring you back. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. The voice that you guys are listening to is Mark Frost. Mark Frost is an economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, capitalist, Schumpeterian, recovering libertarian, and of course, a businessman apparently. And honestly, one of my favorite guests. And I'm going to say this, I think I might have said this before, Mark. I know we have different political ideologies, and you're one of the people arguing with and everything else. Oftentimes, when people come onto the show, I have a sense of being somewhat cynical in my portrayal of them. I often think that they're being somewhat disingenuous in the positions that they take sometimes, and that can make me a little bit callous in dealing with them. But over the time that you've been on the show, you've been an honest actor. And despite us having disagreements and everything else, I have come to the conclusion that even when you make an argument, you're being honest about the argument. I found you to be thoughtful in everything. And even the recovering libertarian part shows this kind of ability to look at a particular ideology and rise above the ideology, with reality being something different. So the voice that you guys were listening to, and I guess that accolades, Mark Frost. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking the $15 hour minimum wage. The idea that that could get put through, the fact that Bernie Sanders was pushing for it. Biden had promised it back in the primaries and then apparently relented or gave up or something. Anyway, we're talking the economics of that minimum wage increase. And we're joined by Mark Frost. He's an entrepreneur, economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, capitalist, Schumpeterian, and recovering libertarian. And formerly, you could follow Mark on Twitter at FrostyCash, but I believe you are still off there. You took a break for the sake of your sanity, basically. Is that right, Mark?
I did. I found Twitter was making me into someone I didn't like, to be blunt. And I was becoming a reactionary personality, and I needed a break. So whether I go back or not, I don't know. I might. Plus, our general counsel hated the fact that I was on there. Every board meeting, he'd be like, "Can you get off Twitter, please? You're going to get us sued or investigated or whatever." Because, as you know, I like to just say my mind, and I don't try to be rude to anybody, but I do try to say my mind, and without, being mean or hateful or rude. But I don't meet the freaks in regular life that I meet on Twitter. I have progressive friends. They're not insane. I have conservative friends. They're not insane. But all these people, a lot of them, go insane on Twitter. That'd be a great psychology thesis. That'd be a great dissertation.
Well, I think that's just anonymous.
On the psyche. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's just acting anonymous on some level. I mean, Shane, you could take it, but that's what I think.
It's true.
Yeah.
No, it's true. And you can, I mean, this is, admittedly, we're in a segue of a segue right now, but like 4chan and these like image boards that were populating the internet back in the day, and the source of a lot of the true, like the grimiest of internet behavior, people are all anonymous, and that's what drives it. And I think people were thinking with Facebook specifically, there's some direct tie to your identity. Literally, they need you to verify your identity in a lot of cases. Although, of course, people have found out, plenty of loopholes for working through that process. Nevertheless, there was this hope that people would change, and I think they do somewhat, but it's a different kind of dirty behavior. And I don't know if it's as ample or if it's as abundant as it is on Twitter, but there is something about being anonymous where you're free to revel in your worst instincts publicly, and everybody can pitch in on it, and it gets ugly. But let's talk minimum wage. Just briefly capping it off, as I said to an earlier guest, you don't need them, speaking of Twitter, and they do not deserve you, Mark. So thank you for joining us on the show. Let's talk the $15 hour minimum wage. I'll hand it right over to you, Mark. What do you think about it simply? Should we have this wage increase? What would it do to the economy? Do you see it as a positive or a negative? Again, from a recovering libertarian perspective, what is your take?
Like most economists on this subject, I have strong opinions of it. I will reference a paper I published about 25 years ago called the Indonesian Minimum Wage Experiment, an interrupted time series. And rarely do we get to do natural experiments or any kind of experiment in economics, for ethical reasons, generally speaking. But the Indonesian government tripled its real minimum wage in 1990. So it gave a great opportunity for researchers and academics like me to go measure these things. And what we found was in Indonesia, sure enough, it caused unemployment. And it caused some pretty massive employment on an 18-month lagged basis. Their economy is not as efficient as the West, and so things take a little longer to radiate. About 2 years later, there was massive political unrest in the country because Indonesia is the fourth largest country and has the youngest population, average age of about 25. There just wasn't enough jobs for people, and the government, corrupt already had some issues with that. So let's talk about what a minimum wage is real quick, because I think your listeners will like this, and I haven't heard any journalists even go over this. There's two types of minimum wages, or let's call it what it is. It's a price floor. The wage is the price of labor, so a minimum wage is a price floor. There's two types of price floors. There's effective price floors, and there's ineffective price floors. An ineffective price floor is if you set the target price of the floor below the market price. So let's say Congress passed a law that said cheeseburgers cannot ever sell for over a nickel. That would be an ineffective price floor because they already sell for way over a nickel. It would be ineffective. It's ceremonial. It lets them say, look, we protected people from expensive hamburgers, when in fact that law had zero impact. It didn't do anything. So it's the same way with labor. Wage is the price of labor. So if you have a price floor, what price floors do if they are effective? If you set the target price above the equilibrium price, that is the market wage, then you're going to cause a surplus. A surplus in the labor market is called unemployment. Minimum wages are the worst way. It's one of the worst institutions I can imagine if you want to help the people that need help the most.
This is where it gets controversial.
Yes, and it brings up a new issue that I think no one really wants to talk about, but we're going to have to talk about it over the next 10 years because it's coming. The truth is, in the economy as it's evolving, there's going to be millions of people that just aren't very productive. I'm just going to be blunt. They're not going to be stellar participants in the economy. They're just not going to be.
So I think just to piggyback on that, because I think it's a fair point, Mark, and I promise I'm going to send it back to you. There's a certain number of people who intellectually, and this is not a hit, there are just some people who are slow, and whatever that percentage of people is, those people are going to have problems, and those people are going to fall through the cracks. But beyond that point, you also have this thing with, I so disagree with you on the minimum wage thing, and we can get back and forth, but I'm going to hand it to you to finish your point. There's this automation aspect too that we also have to deal with, meaning we are getting to the point where the cost of labor as a minimum wage versus the cost of putting a robot into that particular position are getting equal. And when that happens, the value and the necessity of the American worker goes up in smoke on some level. What do you think about that, Mark? Please finish your previous comment, but also, what do you think about that and as a piggyback or as an adjacent to this belief that the minimum wage is one of the worst ways? Please finish.
Well, yeah, because if there's anything I'm pretty darn certain of, and most economists would echo this, is that an effective minimum wage causes unemployment. Now, what kind of unemployment does it cause? Let's use a thought experiment. Let's say you run a sandwich shop and you need to hire people. You want somebody to make sandwiches for you between 10 and 2. Well, how much can you pay them? What's the most you can pay them? Well, let's say let's say they make you $10 an hour. That's what their employment does for you. It brings you in a profit of $10 per hour. Well, you can't pay them $15 per hour or you lose money on that employee. And there's about 12 million people, adults in the United States with IQs 75 or below. The Army won't take them. Their productivity is very low. They're not just slow, they're disabled. They're going to have trouble. They're not going to have trouble. They're going to be unable to compete in the macro and certainly not the microeconomic economy. They simply don't have the productivity there. And I think that portion of our population, which is generally speaking not very productive, is going to increase, not decrease.
Now,
I think it's almost certain. And so that's kind of the philosophy behind it. But if you're concerned about employment, there's one thing that I'm very, very confident of as an economist. Effective price floors cause surpluses. And surpluses in the labor market is unemployment.
But the question is how much?
Certain of that on an empirical basis, but that doesn't mean there isn't non-economic arguments for it.
Well, I mean, it depends on how much unemployment. And not just how much unemployment, it depends on if it's marginal. I mean, if you raise, let's say, the minimum wage, let's take a thought experiment. Let's say it went from 7 to 9. Well, that worker is still $10 an hour productive. And there may be a question from the standpoint of how much the business owner actually wants to keep that worker and everything else. But I'm making the point that the argument against it depends on what that number is, that number is being raised to. I would argue that $15 an hour is not to the point of being so detrimental to a country that's basically lost, 10, 20, 30 million jobs at this point in rebuilding. And when those people get those jobs back, those people will be making $15 an hour. And more importantly, on that front, that group of people who have difficulty competing in the labor market, and I don't know why that number would increase. I mean, maybe you're just saying it because there's a certain number of increase in regards to the population size and everything else. But I agree with you that at a certain level, that there's going to be some level of people who lose their jobs. By the same token, you're talking about 20 or 30 million people that are going to benefit from that wage going up. And like I said, my mom would have been one of those people who would have benefited and who lived in a less than $15 an hour minimum wage time zone. I mean, what do you think about that from the standpoint of the people who are going to benefit from that minimum wage? And just within the context of an economy that can accommodate it, that it depends on what that number is, not necessarily that the number is detrimental in and of itself. Look, because, for example, I don't want kids working. I don't want people working for $3 an hour. And if we didn't have the minimum wage, I guarantee you there will be some jobs where people will be out there for doing $3 an hour. If a job can't accommodate what we consider to be a base wage, maybe that job shouldn't exist. What are your thoughts, Mark? Or am I being too brutal on this one? Oh, we only have 30 seconds. Mark, I'm sorry. We only have 30 seconds. We're going to have to bring you back to fight on this. We're going to have to bring you back.
Sure. From a philosophical perspective on this, I take the right to contract to be almost sacred. So if I'm willing and able to work for 50 cents an hour and you're willing and able to pay me 50 cents an hour, I call that a good trade. But
it's not a good trade if you're in a sense of destitution, meaning you're so desperate because of the way your society and the social order and everything else has been managed and the way that the political system is basically gamed against you. How is that fair of a contract if that person's needs and everything else are basically compelling that person to act as a person, that person making a free choice? How's that fair?
My goal isn't to create a fair society. My goal is to create a good society.
Oh, man. We got to get back into this, I swear. Mark Frost, economist, a professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, capitalist, Schumpeterian, and a recovering libertarian. Mark Frost. Mark, thank you for joining us. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment with Vanessa Beeley.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We are coming up on the 11th anniversary of the U.S. failed coup attempt in Syria. I want you to hear a clip. Let's listen to this clip by Donald Trump. This is probably the truest words Donald Trump has ever spoken in his life. And I include that on his wedding day when he told his wife that he loved her. That's brutal and that's unfair, but still, I'm going with it. It's a morning show. Let's play the clip.
8 long years after President Obama's ill-fated push at regime change, U.S. troops are still on the ground in Syria. More than 500,000 people are dead, hundreds of thousands are terribly injured, and millions more Syrians are displaced. It really is a nightmare of misery. Across the Middle East, we have seen anguish on a colossal scale. We have spent $8 trillion on wars in the Middle East, never really wanting to win those wars. But after all that money was spent and all those lives lost, the young men and women gravely wounded so many. The Middle East is less safe, less stable, and less secure than before these conflicts began.
That's an astonishing statement. A president of the United States is indicting the previous president in a failed putsch attempt. The New York Times had already indicted Obama on this, but that was something that wasn't necessarily talked about on mainstream media, that wasn't necessarily talked about in political circles, in good company. And Trump said it. 500,000 people killed in that coup attempt. $7 trillion or $8 trillion spent in these wars going all the way back from Bush invasion of Iraq. In Syria right now, where we can have a conversation, is guest Vanessa Beeley, international investigative journalist. Vanessa, welcome to the show and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Jamal. It's the 10-year anniversary, by the way.
10-year. I apologize. I'm sorry.
Hopefully we won't make it to the 11th.
Oh, don't say that. Don't say that. But 10, I mean, honestly, 10, 11, I would, it's almost marginal, right? Yeah. I want to be accurate on it. So 10 is absolutely right. So thank you for the correction. Trump is right in that statement, correct? I mean, basically, we did try to overthrow that government. We did try to knock that government down. And what's wild about it, despite Trump saying that, it didn't stop him from burning crops or stealing oil with the intent of either starving out or basically removing energy resources from that particular government to function. What is it like right now? And what is, I guess you could say, the zeitgeist on the ground in Syria, or the framing of mind of the people who are in Syria, who lived, let's say, under Bashar al-Assad when this war started and when this war took place? Please give us your perspective and their take.
Well, I'll try and condense it down. But basically, of course, this year is an election year in Syria. So the government elections will take place in April, May. And that, of course, coincides with Joe Biden's election and inauguration in January of this year. And now what we're seeing, you're absolutely right, under Trump. Trump, for me, was the sanctions emperor. Trump, actually, I think the damage he caused, I hear all the time, yeah, but Trump didn't start any wars. No, he didn't necessarily start any wars, but he didn't really end them either. He increased the ability for genocidal maniacs like Israel and Saudi Arabia to increase their hold in the aggressions they're committing against Palestine and against Yemen, for example. In Syria, of course, he completely ramped up the sanctions, culminating in the Caesar Law at the end of 2019. As you rightly said, he ensured that crops, agricultural areas were burned, that wheat and barley and all manner of resources were effectively stolen by the US proxies from inside Syria and then traded outside Syria, again, as you say, to deprive the Syrian people of any kind of welfare, infrastructure, food, economy, health sector, etc. Sanctions never target what the US tells you they're targeting. They only ever target the people of a target nation. And they effectively double down on the pressure against those people, either prior military action, during military action, or after military action. They are a weapon, and they are actually, in my view, a more brutal and more criminal weapon even than military aggression. And that's saying something.
Vanessa, just to interject for 1 second, they're very pernicious because on some level the public doesn't necessarily see them as an act of war, and yet their effect is, all intents and purposes, war. I mean, Bill Clinton, 500,000 kids in Iraq when he passed those sanctions. And, we often say, well, Bush killed 1 million people in Iraq. Clinton killed nearly 500,000 kids. And when asked about it, Madden and Albright say, yeah, it was necessary. Think about that. That's an astonishing thing. These were real. Yeah, I mean, these.
Who is killing what is killing the majority of Yemenis? It's the blockade, the siege, and the sanctions, right? I made a statement today, and I said basically, sanctions are so insidious because, as you rightly say, they're described outside the target country as non-lethal measures. And yet, effectively, they probably kill more people with less ability to defend themselves against it than military aggression. Just think about that for a second. And, that's the idea that people need to put into their heads. The people here are being deprived of virtually everything that makes their lives feasible. The entire health and humanitarian sector is being decimated, not through military aggression. It was already hugely decimated by terrorist occupations and invasions. Then came the period when there was some degree of military victory against those terrorist forces, and there was a feeling of, right, okay, now Syria can start to restore and rebuild itself. Bang, Trump brings in the Caesar Law and, of course, targets the Syrian bank itself. Inflation is through the roof, and resources are being stolen, including the oil, right? But including all other manner of resources that are necessary and essential to human life. So this is effectively a war crime, because as soon as you start targeting infrastructure, civilian infrastructure, you start depriving civilians of essential resources, that's a war crime.
Well,
So sanctions are a war crime.
it seems that the goal is to basically freeze Syria in a permanent state of decay, where it can't necessarily organize the energies of Syria to repair itself. Two things. What was Syria like before all of this took place? Meaning every country has its political back and forths or its issues. You know what I mean? Every country has its fights. Every country has its corruption and so forth. And to me, every country has its struggles. Meaning the women in Saudi Arabia are pushing the drive. Well, that's their struggle in that country, that they're pushing against this kind of immovable object, whether it's civil rights, whether it's tribal issues, across the board. That's the way I see it. What was it like in Syria before this failed putsch attempt, or before these foreign fighters basically fled into the country, pushed by Saudi Arabia, United States, and some of these other terrorist groups? And beyond that, what is the role of Russia and Iran in Syria right now that you've been able to see?
Well, I think, and I will just report on the testimony that I've heard from civilians all over the areas of Syria that I've visited, that prior to 2011, nobody saw this war coming, by the way, because prior to 2011, Syria was prosperous. It was perceived to be reformist and progressive. It was perceived to be probably one of the most progressive states in the region. People describe it always as the most secure and stable country in the Middle East. They talk about the fact that they could go out at any time of day or night and never feel threatened, never feel unsafe. Crime levels were incredibly low. This country was a beacon actually in the Middle East. Of course it had issues. Of course there were reformist movements. Of course there were issues with the government, just as you rightly say, there would be in any country. But if you asked anyone in this country, would they rather go back to pre-2011 and start all over again? I would almost bet that even some of those who took up arms against their own people would say yes.
Vanessa, we've only got a few minutes left. Thank you for joining us. I want to use the little remaining time we have to talk about something a little bit more personal for you. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Basically, the BBC doxed your car, and that might sound weird, but you have a vehicle that you drive in Syria, a fabulous one, might I say myself. I absolutely love this. I'm not going to give out details because I don't want to contribute to this, but basically the BBC published a picture of your vehicle, of your automobile, and it seems completely unnecessary. In fact, it seems like a threat, a tacit threat, basically, giving anybody who would want to target you in the region what they would need to target you, which is horrifying, a horrifying travesty of journalistic injustice. The fact that they would think to do that is crazy to me. We've only got a minute, but what do you think? Am I right in the way I'm viewing this?
Well, yeah, it's absolutely right. But of course, this is what Western media has been doing to the Syrian people for 10 years, effectively doxing all of them and inviting terrorist attacks and covering for those terrorist attacks. So, to some degree, it's perfectly normal. But yeah, the publishing of a car, and initially they showed the number plate. And of course, it's not actually my car. I can't own a car in Syria as a foreign national. So it's a colleague's car that was being lent to me. So they've not only, if you like, doxed me, they've doxed the owner of the car, because by showing the number plate, anybody that wants to can trace the owner. And it's not only the publishing of the photo was on my Facebook page. I didn't take ownership for it. I simply published the photo. So they've made the leap to it being my car, if you like, rather than just the car that I use. And of course, they've contextualized it with a narrative which basically points the finger at me as, guess what, a sadist. 30. Which, as you rightly say, is encouragement to those groups supported by the BBC, which are the majority of the extremist groups inside Syria. And of course, my challenge to the BBC, well, if you're going to dox me over the use of a car with a photograph of the internationally recognized president of the country in the back that the majority of cars have in Syria, 15. Then I would challenge
Vanessa,
them.
I'm sorry, we're out of time. We've got to close it. Everybody follow Vanessa on Twitter, Vanessa Beeley, MintPressNews.com, and Patreon.com/Vanessa Beeley. You're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be back in a minute with headlines. Thanks, Vanessa.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another hour, our last hour this morning, in fact, of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, events, and more across the United States, as well as across the divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the bringer of context, the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, I hope everybody's morning continues to go well. Let's get into the headlines. First up, in COVID news, at least 1,477 new coronavirus deaths yesterday, also 58,530 new cases, both in the United States. In the U.S., over the past week, there has been an average of 57,400 cases per day. That is a decrease of 16% from the average 2 weeks earlier. And as of this morning, more than 29,247,000 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, while just under 529,000 total have died from it. City officials predicted Wednesday that all New Yorkers will be eligible to get the coveted COVID-19 vaccine before the end of spring. Currently, between 4 million and 5 million New Yorkers are eligible to get the vaccine. Dr. Jay Varma, that's Bill de Blasio's senior advisor for public health, went on to say that, quote, "We want to be in a situation where vaccine supply exceeds demand," quote unquote. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton on Wednesday threatened to sue the city of Austin for choosing to keep its COVID-19 mask mandate for businesses in place. The AG accused Austin of not complying with Governor Greg Abbott's recent executive order, which ended his statewide mask mandate and banned coronavirus restrictions on businesses. The governor's order has the force and effect, I'm quoting here, has the force and effect of state law and supersedes local rules and regulations, end quote. In a letter to Austin Mayor Steve Adler and Travis County Judge Andy Brown. A quote here again from Paxton on Twitter: "You and local health authorities have until 6 p.m. today to rescind any mask mandates or business operating restrictions and come into full compliance with GA 34, end quote. Otherwise, on behalf of the state of Texas, I will sue you," end quote. He followed the threat with a taunt, writing that, quote, "City county leaders must not be thinking clearly. Maybe it's oxygen deprivation from quintuple masking," quote unquote. One quick comment from me here. Isn't the same federal approach that gives individual states the ability to buck what the federal government wants them to do? Or federalist approach, I should say. Shouldn't that apply to localities too? If you live in a city or a county, this is more of a philosophical thing here. And for some reason, my mind particularly thinks this would apply in Texas, known for like its independence and its focus for self-reliance. Shouldn't the city of Austin be able to buck this mandate from the state governor in the same way that the governor of Texas is able to buck what Biden wants him to do? I don't know. Again, it's a philosophical argument and maybe misplaced, but it just comes to mind.
Yes.
The country of Denmark has put its use of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine on hold on reports that some people who received it developed blood clots, and after one person died from blood clots after receiving the shot, they're still trying to understand whether there's a link between the vaccine and the clotting. They don't believe there is one, but they're nevertheless putting the use of the vaccine on hold until they determine that. Back to the U.S. In national political news, Minnesota's Supreme Court denied an appeal from ex-Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin on Wednesday. After the state Supreme Court's decision, District Judge Peter Cahill could reinstate a third-degree murder charge. By the end of the day Wednesday, jury selection had seated 5 jurors. The court will need 14 altogether, 12 for deliberations and 2 alternates. The court will be reconvening at 8 a.m. Central Time on Thursday, when Cahill will address the third-degree murder charge issue before resuming the selection process. Thomas Lane, J. Alexander Kung, and Tu Tao face charges of aiding and abetting and manslaughter. Those are the other officers on the scene with Chauvin when they killed George Floyd, when Chauvin killed George Floyd. The Senate on Wednesday confirmed Michael S. Reagan, the former top environmental regulator for North Carolina, to lead the Environmental Protection Agency Mr. Reagan's mission will be putting forward aggressive new regulations to meet President Biden's pledge of eliminating fossil fuel emissions from the electric power sector by 2035, significantly reducing emissions from automobiles and preparing the United States to emit no net carbon pollution by the middle of the century. I'm going to put in my other weird interjection here. just another one in the long line of them, I guess. In my opinion, I wish that we were using the climate crisis that we're in. Like, it would be very cool if we weren't just using it. Okay, yes, you reduce carbon emissions, you come up with other and more sustainable ways of generating power. That is all very well and good. I also wish we were talking about like ecological restoration on a much larger scale, like greenifying vast portions of wild lands. For one thing, making more public lands. For another thing, giving more protections to public lands, but also like substantially trying to repair the ecologies of these various places. Like, again, maybe misplaced or maybe out of nowhere, but I would prefer to live on like the best planet possible in terms not just of its ecological diversity, but the abundance of wildlife. I wish that we had a lot of stuff going on this planet because, if we're going to live here into perpetuity, we should try to live on as good a place as possible. You can even view it in the simplest of economic terms, like we want to maximize the utility of the satisfaction that we're getting or whatever, but you of course also want the planet to be a sustainable place to live. And if we're going out into space, you want Earth to be like the green bastion of what we came from. I don't know, Jamarl, does this make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense, but it's not about, the problem is the prevailing ideology on this planet is how do you maximize profit? And in maximizing profit, the earth, the ground that we live on, is considered a utility of sorts. Meaning, I don't mean utility in the way that we're talking about like gas or oil or something like that. I just mean it's a area that can be exploited for economic gain. And in that area to be exploited for economic gain, if you have a huge amount of resources, then for you, the planet is lovely. What does a planet look like for, if you had $100 million in the bank, like a Nancy Pelosi? And from your standpoint, is it a beautiful world with that much cash in the bank? The answer is yes, it is. The question becomes, well, what about for everybody else? That's the catch. And for everybody else, well, if you're 1% of the population, if you're 0.1% of the population, and your ability to make more is from exploiting the land, you're going to exploit the land. You're going to give money to politicians to exploit the land. You're going to be paying people who are at the political scale, who are in the media, for that matter, who are even working in those businesses or working adjunct to those businesses to exploit the land. Everything is going to be done for all the way downstream, even to the people making, let's say, $50,000 a year, to exploit the land. So it's like the environmental movement. The reason why it doesn't necessarily have wins, as opposed to someone like the civil rights movement. Well, the civil rights movement is just more consumers. The environmental movement is hitting directly at this notion of profit and at this notion of the environment just being a resource. Like, consider for the moment, you can have, this is a bad example, but like oranges shipped from, let's say, Chile in order to come to Florida. And you think to yourself, well, wait a minute, Florida can make its own oranges. Yeah, but it's cheaper to ship them from Chile. It's only cheaper because you don't take the cost of traveling from point A to point B in effect. You don't take the cost of what it means to pull the oil out of the ground or the smog that's produced or the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you do that and escalate that to pretty much everything across the world, especially in terms of the environment. Yeah, you got to deal with the first problem. The first problem is primary. That's my thought. But I agree with you. 1,000%. I would love for restoration of this planet. And, if we are running around the galaxy, meaning we're sending people to Mars, or we're sending people to the moon, or we're sending all of these devices out into the world, we should care that our environment is taken back. Think of the number of people that carbon dioxide kill a year, meaning the smog and all of these other things that people inhale. Think of the environmental degradation from the standpoint of lead in the water and what that do to kids, their mental development and the development of certain neighborhoods, for that matter, even the health of certain neighborhoods. And you can go down the line on that stuff. Yeah, it has serious consequences for us as human beings. But again,
it does, and those are direct.
Yes.
Those are direct. Those are, I mean, you're talking about airborne and waterborne pollutants right there. Those are direct consequences that admittedly are chronic. You don't see their effects until years later usually, but still, those are, again, for looking at it from an economic standpoint, you could make and save a lot of money on a sort of global and even a national scale just by reducing pollution, because people would be smarter, frankly. Airborne pollutants like reduce intelligence and the quality of life. They reduce your longevity and everything pretty much across the board. If you're born and you're raised and you live in these centers where airborne pollutants are higher. So I would think there's a strong case to be made, and I hear some people making it, but even then, I'll be honest, Jamarl, I want to see genetically restored woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers.
That's you want it all. You want a Jurassic Park.
I want it all. I want it all back. Yeah, maybe not the dinosaurs, because those are a bit older. But
I would be content if we just cared about human beings with a certain level of empathy that we care about, let's say, I don't know, a cousin, a third cousin. How about that? I'm not even asking for love. Just like, all right, I have a third cousin there. I have a familial allegiance to that third cousin. Even if we had that level of concern and care, like, because you remember, and I'll let you go back to headlines, but when Kyriakou was on the show, and we were having this conversation with a program I think that Donald Trump put through that was giving money to basically inmates after they got out of prison to ensure that they did well in school and everything else. And the point was that the recidivism rate went down. And it was like, yeah, of course it went down because you were supporting people in a way where they didn't have to go back to whatever they were doing. And if you believe that the recidivism rate goes down after that person had a life of crime, would it not be better to get it to that person before they get into that particular scenario? Meaning, we can look at the areas around the country and say, what are the highest crime spots? And we can say, if that money lowered the recidivism rate, is it possible that giving those people money will lower their rate of crime, lower their chance or necessity of crime?
I hear you. And speaking of John Kyriakou, I do want to get back to the headlines. We're
like
6 minutes into this tangent here already. But he has a good article, also new, over on Consortium News, about a company that was supplying prisons with food. And one of the kinds of food they supplied them with was dog food, where prisoners were eating dog food. They didn't know it. It was mislabeled.
They put it on tacos.
In tacos, exactly. And he has a good sort of story in there, which I think is a cool story, despite the circumstances, about how he and another prisoner, an Iraqi, went out and foraged in the prison yard for dandelions in order to eat the first salad he'd had in 2 years, which it was like olive oil they stole from the cafeteria or whatever. It's just a cool story. I mean, pretty harsh circumstances, but if you're foraging dandelion greens, that's usually an interesting situation to be in. Anyway.
But it does make the point of how little they care about human beings. It makes it perfectly.
It is true.
Some of us are disposable.
The company only had to pay to recompense the legal fees. They didn't face, as far as he reported in that article, any other penalty than like $500,000 that they had to reimburse I think it was the Department of Justice for investigating it. That was all. And so that was all they had to face. Anyway. Back to the headlines. The trial of Kyle Rittenhouse, the teenager accused of killing 2 people during protests in Kenosha, Wisconsin over the summer, has been delayed until November 1st. Rittenhouse, 18, is accused of shooting and killing Joseph Rosenbaum and Anthony Huber with an AR-style rifle at an August 25th protest sparked by the police shooting of Jacob Blake. He's also accused of wounding Gage Grosskreutz. He is charged with 2 counts of first-degree homicide and 1 count of attempted homicide, also facing charges of reckless endangerment and possessing a weapon while under the age of 18. He was 17 at the time. Rittenhouse has pled not guilty to all charges. Prosecutors and Rittenhouse's attorney agreed to delay the start of the trial to give them more time to prepare. In international news, a Saudi court has rejected an appeal by prominent women's rights activist Loujain Al-Hathloul that would have allowed her to travel freely. She was sentenced in December to 5 years and 8 months in prison, but was released in February. She was appealing for her sentence to be overturned and a 5-year travel ban lifted. The terrorism court convicted Hathloul on charges of harming national security, seeking to change the Saudi political system, and using her relations with foreign governments and rights groups to, quote, pressure the kingdom to change its laws and systems, end quote. Hathloul said she was sexually assaulted and tortured while in detention, including being waterboarded, flogged, and electrocuted. Saudi authorities have repeatedly denied allegations of torture and sexual abuse in their prisons. Her release in February came less than a week after the White House called on the kingdom to release political prisoners, including women's rights activists, dropping her name in without dropping her name, I guess, giving her a reference there. U.S. President Joe Biden has vowed to pressure Saudi Arabia into improving their human rights record. We'll see how that goes, though. One last quick headline here. Myanmar's military rulers have accused the ousted leader Aung San Suu Kyi of illegally accepting $600,000, that's 430,000 pounds, and gold. No evidence was provided for the charge, which is the fiercest charge they've leveled against her since detaining her on the February 1st coup last month. Suu Kyi has been held for the past 5 weeks in an undisclosed location and faces several charges, including causing fear and alarm, quote unquote, illegally possessing radio equipment, and breaking COVID-19 restrictions. Brigadier General Za Myint-Tun also accused President Win Myint and several cabinet ministers of corruption. Myanmar has been gripped by street protests since the military seized control. At least 7 more people were killed by security forces on Thursday, taking the total death toll to more than 60, and the military has dismissed criticism of its actions, instead placing the blame for the violence on Suu Kyi. I don't know how that works. I don't know how they can detain somebody and then accuse them for killing protesters when it's clearly their troops that are doing it. I guess what they'd be saying is, well, she set us up for this situation. It's inevitable, because she was in charge before. But of course, that's victim blaming. That is Darvo, to use a somewhat obscure term from psychological abuse. Anyway, we've got to go into a break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back on the other side of this short break with our next guest, Alan MacLeod, senior staff writer for Mint Press News, talking about propaganda in its various forms. Be right back in a minute.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. I think I mentioned earlier today, I've developed a penchant for reading through, or at the very least watching, some of the press briefings that come out of the White House. Ned Price, for example, or Jen Psaki, Biden's press secretary. And it is astonishing to hear some of the things that they say. Let's play the clip of Ned Price talking about the briefing on March 8th. And this is the one on Honduras, because I want to give you this perspective. I like to give context. That's my job. That's what I see my job as. And the State Department is not the place where you're going to get context like every other government, especially when the ideal breaks away from the reality. You get propaganda. Let's play the clip. I love this.
Is it fair to say that the Biden administration is pursuing regime change in Venezuela?
It is fair to say that the Biden administration supports the democratic aspirations of the people of Venezuela. Our overriding goal is to support a peaceful democratic transition in Venezuela through free and fair presidential and parliamentary elections, and to help the Venezuelan people rebuild their lives and their country. We know at the root of much of the misery and the suffering of the people of Venezuela stands one individual. And we've been very clear that Nicolas Maduro is a dictator. His actions have not been in the best interests of the people of Venezuela. It hasn't just been the United States that has been saying that. It has been the United States and many of our closest partners, both in the region and well beyond.
So it's basically a nicer way of saying Maduro must go.
We believe and we support the democratic aspirations of the people of Venezuela. That is why we are committed to supporting the people through humanitarian measures and also targeting regime officials and their cronies involved in human rights abuses and corruption.
Basically, yes. Maduro must go. And I can almost forgive propaganda coming out of the State Department. This is kind of the espoused American ideal, per se. But this is also backed up in places like the New York Times that seems to be as assiduously pushing out this American perspective as the State Department. In one of the New York Times articles, Venezuela is mired in one of the world's worst humanitarian crises under Maduro, who, through a mix of corruption and neglect, oversaw the decay of country's oil infrastructure that is propped up by the economy. What they don't say is sanctions. In fact, you have to go down to paragraph 10 and 11 to actually get a certain degree of reality. Paragraph 11, the United States has been a force at an international campaign to force Maduro out of power since the disputed election in 2018. It was disputed like, Evo Morales' election was disputed at this point. And one of the few policy priorities that has been advanced by both Biden and Trump administration. And they make the point that $31 billion was basically removed from Venezuela with those sanctions. And they're shocked that a poor country where oil has hit the skids, that removing $31 billion would have an adverse effect on the economy of that country. But that's not the way they're going to talk about it. To have a conversation about this and other articles another article that the guest wrote, Alan MacLeod. Alan MacLeod is a senior writer for Press News. He's the author of 2 books, Bad News from Venezuela, 20 Years of Fake News and Misreporting and Propaganda in the Information Age, Still Manufacturing Consent. Yeah, Alex. Alan, welcome to the show, man. Thank you for joining us.
Good to be with you.
Thank you. I was looking at the last book, and I apologize. I think I ran those two on together. The Venezuela reporting is pernicious. And, in reading this article is named, where is it? There we are. Biden grants protections for Venezuelans to remain in the United States. And the entire framing of this is that the U.S., for some reason that the New York Times agrees with, has a right and a say-so over who's the leader of that country, and even whether the people of that country eat or not because of the sanctions that they're putting into play. And they are using all of these things, all of these words. Oh, it's horrible. It's a dumpster fire, et cetera, et cetera. What they don't talk about is the sanctions and the campaign that have been used and leveled against that country for God knows how long to topple that government, make that country scream. Alan, please give us your take on this, and even the framing that the New York Times and some of these other articles write about when they're talking about Venezuela.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so the main framing, as you rightly said, is that the United States has been trying to overthrow the government for 2 decades now. These sanctions have been condemned at the United Nations, called a crime against humanity. An American UN special rapporteur visited Venezuela and calculated that 100,000 Venezuelans had been killed because of Trump's sanctions. And now we're on to Biden. And the UN also said that the sanctions are specifically designed to target the poor and most vulnerable. And as a result of these sanctions, Venezuela has lost 99% of its revenues. I mean, it's quite difficult to compare a state with a household, but imagine if you lost 99% of your revenue and that just kept on going on for year after year, you'd be in a pretty bad spot as well. But this is never suggested. A lot of the time, it's not even mentioned in the media, so most people don't even know what's going on. And so what that leads to is a situation where people think, oh, it's so bad in Venezuela, so maybe we have to intervene. So in fact, it's this perfect system where, the medicine is worse than the disease, and it causes the need for more intervention and more pain down the road. One thing I would say is that New York Times article you referenced is written by Anatoly Kurmanayev, And I actually interviewed him for my PhD. I think it was in 2015 or 2016. And he told me on camera that he considers himself a mercenary for hire and part of the ideological spear against Maduro. He said that, well, the term fake news hadn't been popularized by then, but he said he intentionally plants false or grossly misleading articles into the press. And he does that because he's got this, ideology which he wants to see the government overthrown. And
you have to get us that clip. You have to get us that clip. You have to get us that clip.
Long interview. It's a long publisher. I've written about it before, but yeah, I mean, after all this, after I wrote about it, what happens? He gets promoted, and he turns into what is effectively royalty in Latin America, which is a New York Times correspondent. It's the most cushy job that you can get in the media.
Maybe this is an opportunity to go into sanctions. We're focusing on propaganda more generally, and of course, this is what happens. It is painted in the Western press as a reason to vilify the Venezuelan government, and constantly wheelie about the fact that we are doing the thing that is leading directly to the economic deprivation. It's us. We're hitting them, and then accusing them of hitting themselves, and then saying, if you keep hitting yourself, we're going to have to step in and hit you some more. And it seems like the UN, it seems like internationally, there are war crimes. We were talking about this just a little while ago with Vanessa Beeley, in fact, who recommended that, these are effectively war crimes, where effectively you can't target civilians, and yet we are painting with the broadest and the bloodiest brush, in that these sanctions, while they do hurt Venezuelan officials, I'm sure politically to some extent, they also, the vast majority of the people we're hitting with them are civilians. And yet, as far as I can tell, the UN has not taken serious steps towards defining these as war crimes. While they may be de facto war crimes, they are not de jure war crimes. In other words, they're still legal. And I guess maybe the UN would choose not to do so, because if they were to do so, we're the one using them the most. Trying to prevent them or curtail their use would hit us the hardest. Again, we were talking primarily about propaganda, but because we've moved pretty squarely to this. Any take on that, Ellen?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you look at the UN General Assembly, they tend to put out very sensible programs, and they tend to reflect the opinions of the world. But the problem is that the UN was always set up by the big powers to make sure that whatever they say goes. So the US, Russia, China, the UK, France have got a veto there, which essentially means that anything they don't want to happen doesn't happen. And the US has got a double veto because it is the world hegemon. And so anything it doesn't want to happen doesn't happen. We can see that, for instance, with Cuba, where every year the world gets together, votes like 183 to 2, and the two are the US and Israel, and maybe sometimes some tiny Pacific nation that goes along with the US to stop the blockade of Cuba, which has been going on for longer than I've been alive, longer than my father's been alive. But it doesn't matter, because ultimately the world runs on force rather than laws. And so that's really the big flaw with the UN. It just doesn't have the ability to enforce any of its decisions if the big powers don't want them to happen.
Yeah, and that's massively unfortunate, because, like you said, media in this case is a weapon. And that weapon is basically used against people who we don't particularly like, even to the detriment. Because what people don't really get is that the point of sanctions is to create enough internal strife where the people within the country topple the government of that country. Meaning the people suffer so much, where you squeeze them so much that the responsibility for the failure is pointed to at the government itself. Even if the country knows that the sanctions are there, even if they know the sanctions are vicious, they may get to the point where you can create enough depravity where the public relents. That's the whole point of it, whether it's Iran or whether it's Venezuela. And then it's finding some patsy, basically a traitor to that particular nation, to come in and be the figurehead. Even if that person has little to no support, it doesn't really matter. If he has support in the West, that's in and of itself enough to basically run roughshod over those national inclinations. One more clip real quick before we go into the next thing. Honduras. Because this was also basically level at Honduras. And I want you to add a little bit of context to the Honduras one also, Alan. Let's please play the Honduras clip if we have it.
I don't have it.
So, Alan, there was another one where they referenced Honduras. And it was asked whether or not the gentleman was a partner. The president of Honduras was a partner. And I'm going to let you hear Ned Price's response, and I'm going to show you the story that broke yesterday. Let's do this. Let's take a break. We'll be back in a moment. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are here with Alan MacLeod, senior writer or senior staff writer for Mint Press News, author of 2 books, Bad News from Venezuela, 2 years or 20 years of fake news and misreporting, and Propaganda in the Information Age, Still Manufacturing Consent. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here.
Real opinions for real people.
Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out,
we actually let them expand on their views.
What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. And pretty soon you'll be able to reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. There was a fascinating story that came out the other day. And this was on Honduras President Juan Orlando Hernandez of Honduras. Now, Ned was asked the question of whether or not, meaning the spokesperson for the State Department, Orlando Hernandez is a partner. Well, Orlandez is basically being dredged up in a criminal investigation into cocaine trafficking. This is the New York Times. President Juan Orlando Hernandez of Honduras promised to protect drug traffickers using the nation's security forces and law enforcement agencies to help them flood the United States with cocaine, an American prosecutor said on Tuesday. Quote, they would, as the president put it, shove the drugs right up the noses of those gringos. And Ned was asked, is this guy a partner? He was asked again the next day, is this guy a partner? And he wouldn't necessarily come to a conclusion. The catch here is, who was there before Ned? And who was there before Orlando? And was there a coup that had taken place under the Obama administration with the blessing of one Hillary Clinton that destabilized that country to the point where this gentleman would take power? To have a conversation about this, not to mention we're going to also have a conversation about his recent article that is utterly phenomenal with the calculations that were made. Alan MacLeod, senior staff writer for Mint Press News and author of 2 books, Bad News from Venezuela, 20 Years of Fake News and Misreporting, and also Propaganda in the Information Age, Still Manufacturing Consent. Alan, what are your thoughts on that? Because basically it seems that the way this is done is that Ned gets there, he says something, drops all context, and the reporters in the room just write it down, entirely missing the context. And then they would say that this is news, and anything deviating from this is propaganda. When I try to add context to what they're reporting, it changes, let's say, the framing, and it changes even almost the perspective on some level of what is taking place. And more importantly, whether or not the person comes to the same conclusion that they had before is less relevant than the fact that they were given the additional information where they can make somewhat of an honest assessment. What are your thoughts?
This case, when you compare it to Venezuela, really shows that there is zero interest in Washington in supporting human rights and democracy in Latin America or anywhere else for that matter. You talked about context. I think that's very important. You alluded to it in your introduction. Honduras was a thriving democracy in the 2000s. It elected a democratic leftist candidate, Zelaya, President Zelaya, Manuel Zelaya, And he changed the country for the better. He reduced crime, reduced inequality, and was very popular indeed. One of the problems for Washington, however, was that he was getting far too pally with people like Evo Morales in Bolivia and Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. And so the White House green-lighted a coup under the Obama administration. Hillary Clinton actually, in the first edition of her memoir, said that she rendered the question of Zelaya moot, meaning that all the Latin American governments that were complaining and in uproar about this US-sponsored coup were silenced by Clinton. She took that out of the second edition of her memoir after people like me and other journalists started pointing that out. But yeah, that's part of the record that we should really think about. And since then, so for over 10 years, Honduras has been one of the most violent and unequal societies anywhere in the world. And it is perhaps the main reason why there is a huge wave of emigration from the country, with many of them walking across Mexico to the southern border in the US, making up the lion's share of that famous refugee caravan that we had a couple of years ago, which caused so much consternation in the media. But that sort of context was just not given in these articles. And so anybody reading it will have no idea what's really going on and no sense of history, and therefore can't really piece anything together.
Okay, so let's do this. We have that video actually. So let's play the video. Let's play the clip so you guys can hear Ned. I have to be honest, I've been listening for the last 2 days, and I think I'm going to make a habit out of it. Let's play the clip.
What I would say, and this applies to Honduras, of course, is that we are committed to fighting corruption around the world. Corruption and impunity are endemic in some countries in the Americas. We believe that we have to work with partners to address broader governance challenges. First, if we want to solve poverty, inequity, lack of representation in government. And so we'll use all tools at our disposal to fight that corruption and impunity, and to fight to combat that transnational crime that often goes along with it. And we do that not just to be virtuous. Of course, we believe in anti-corruption. We believe in doing everything we can to combat transnational crime. But we also do that knowing that these same forces tend to be drivers of the sort of irregular migration that we have seen from the region. So our approach is one of partnership with the broader region. It is partnership with countries of the Northern Triangle. It is partnership with our partners in Mexico, of course, knowing that we have to fight and combat these forces of corruption if we are going to make progress on the broader challenge of irregular migration.
Partner?
Yeah.
Hernandez?
Look, we understand that we need to work constructively with countries in the Northern Triangle. I would hate to put, I would be hesitant to put a label on it. I think what we understand and what we are confident in is that unless we make progress on these underlying challenges, we're not going to make progress on the challenge of irregular migration.
He couldn't say it. He couldn't say whether or not the guy was a partner or not in the region. Because if he said it, and this guy gets implicated in the case where they're shoving cocaine up gringos' noses, and a few years prior, the guy who was there, who was actually looking out for the benefit of the public, wasn't looking to shove cocaine into gringos' noses, then that's something that the media should ask, right? I mean, shouldn't that be a question? It's like, well, hey, look, Hillary Clinton was involved in getting Zelaya out of office. And now you've had that country as a basket case with a huge number of migrants coming to the border as a result of what took place. But they never asked that question. It seems like that should be the question. Alan, what are your thoughts on this before we move to your article?
I think the reason they don't ask that question is because of the implications. If people actually knew that, it would imply or suggest that we have to change policy in Latin America and maybe look for a more humane foreign policy in that sort of part of the region, as part of the world. The problem is that the US is carrying out exactly what it wants in Latin America, And what it wants is to keep those countries down and take the resources and the profits from those countries and send them back to the banks in Washington, in New York, and to shareholders in large corporations. And, if some people develop drug problems because of, rampant corruption in some of these countries, well, that's just too bad. But as long as they're under control and they're quiet, then they can be partners all they like.
And okay, so we've only got a couple of minutes left, and I want to make sure we move to your article, which is interesting and worthy of at least 15 minutes of a discussion on its own. For those listening, you can find this. It's over on Mint Press News. The title of the article is "Government Linked CSIS Urges DC to Partner with Social Media Firms to, quote, promote protest movements," end quote. And you're talking about a think tank based in DC that is encouraging the American government, encouraging Washington, D.C. to promote protest movements specifically in China and Russia, basically to get involved, to engage in election interference and political interference in general in those countries. Can you talk a bit more about the research you were doing on this, and specifically how they were urging the DC establishment, what they were urging, just generally, what is the detail on the story, Alan?
The CSIS is your standard Washington think tank, funded by Raytheon and Northrop Grumman and Middle East dictatorships and the State Department itself. And it's got all the usual characters as members like, Henry Kissinger. And what they were saying is that the US government should, quote, think creatively about public-private partnerships that can expand US interests in other countries. And one of the ones specifically they talked about was working with social media giants like Facebook and Twitter to try to encourage protests and even foment them and keep them going. And, they specifically talked about which countries they'd like to see this in. And it will surprise nobody that it's only the countries where they have governments that the US doesn't like. So Iran, Cuba, Russia, China, etc. But this is kind of really just talking about something that's already happened. Facebook already works very closely with the State Department, as does Twitter. The US State Department actually created an entire Twitter clone a few years ago for Cuba called Zunzunio, which purported to be an independent social network that Cubans could use, but was actually designed in Washington for the purposes of overthrowing the Cuban government. So what would happen is first they would, give you messages that you saw, but slowly they'd increase the sort of anti-government talk that you see in your feed. And then one day it will be everybody out, 10 p.m., get to the main square. We're going to do this, So social media has long been used as a tool of soft power by Washington. And this is really just the latest incarnation of it. All the big social networks are, well, pretty much all of them are owned by Americans, and they're headquartered in Silicon Valley. And that means that they are required to follow American law. And the larger they get, the more and more intertwined with the State Department they seem to become. And that's a real problem, not just for American democracy, but also the democracies and media landscapes of every country in the world.
The last question, Alan, we only have about 2 minutes left. $15 an hour minimum wage just failed. Basically, Democrats told the American public, you're not worth it. By the same token, your article makes the point that the United States or U.S. allies dropped 46 bombs per day for 20 years. That's astonishing. And I remember Obama in his last year dropped over 20,000. I think it was like 26,000 bombs. Like, to put that in perspective, that is astonishing. And you made the point in this article that we've been at war almost for the entirety of this country's history. Could you talk about that before we close? I mean, this is somewhat of a big deal. I mean, has been fighting for 227 years of the 244-year history. This article was astonishing in regards to the metrics that it came up. Please discuss. We have about 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay, sure. So I suppose that's really a reflection of the priorities of elites and political parties in Washington, that when hundreds of billions of dollars are dropped on a new aircraft that doesn't even work, well, that's just too bad. But it's never questioned, like, how are we going to pay for this? But the minute anything progressive comes up, like Medicare for all or student debt relief, that suddenly, elicits a storm of of disapproval in Washington about the costs of it. How are we going to do this? And those two things are linked because the US is really addicted to war. As you said, for the vast majority of its existence since 1776, it has been at war. There's only been a few periods in the 19th century and the 1950s where the country wasn't actually at war. And these two things are connected because the amount of money the US spends on war, I mean, it's close to $1 trillion a year, the defense budget. Just imagine what you could do with $1 trillion. You could fund you could have a Sweden-like social democracy, a paradise. You could have free Medicare, you could have free college, you could have a $15, $20 minimum wage, you could have high-quality public housing, you could build an entire, public transport network, a rapid one like they've got in China, across the United States. You could tackle climate change, you could end unemployment and homelessness.
5G.
All these things are possible.
Even investment in 5G.
The money was to the military instead.
Yeah, even investment in 5G. I mean, China has like 20% of some insane amount in comparison to what we've been able to do with 5G. Yeah, we could invest in us. That money that we spend, that $1 trillion. And most of that, if I'm not mistaken, half is just a jobs program. Like half the money that's spent is just for jobs. I mean, that stuff could be brought back here where we could be building this country. Alan, thank you for joining us, man. I really appreciate your insight. Alan MacLeod is senior staff writer to Mint Press News and author of 2 books, Bad News from Venezuela, 20 Years of Fake News and Misreporting, and the other book, Propaganda in the Information Age, Still Manufacturing Consent. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. By the way, you can also follow Alan on Twitter at Alan R. MacLeod and find his writings at mintpressnews.com and various other fine journalism organizations. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back with the wrap.
Fault Lines. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're taking your calls. We're in our wrap segment, last segment of the show today, one of the last segments of the show this week. If you want to get in, now's your best opportunity. The number is 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. Let's go to Tarif, calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you were on the line. What's on your mind?
Thank you y'all for taking my call. First of all, I'd like to say free Julian Assange. I have 4 quick comments. GameStop shares went up again to as high as 350. I think it's down to 265, but it still went up. The Twitter's in trouble in Russia. They're gonna slowly phase them out. That goes along with India and also Hungary and Poland and Uganda being hard on them, and have other people coming up with their own social platforms like, what's his name, Bob Lindell dealing with My Pillow. He just announced yesterday come out with his own platform, to me, which is good. I know you probably got some heavy hitters with him, some investors. And my last comment is dealing with the South China Sea. An admiral came out with told Washington bureaucrats that China might swallow up Taiwan in the next 6 years. Then a Chinese diplomat came out and said that's not true. So that's like a war of words right there. So things, it's not de-escalating in that particular world. So we got to be careful with that. So yeah, that's all I want to say. Feed your own science, of course.
Tarif, thank you for the call. For those listening, Tarif calls in almost every morning, and he usually has a collection of headlines, like a collection of different takes, and it's often stuff that I haven't heard. And sometimes it feels like it comes out of nowhere. But nevertheless, Tarif, thank you for the call. We got more, and we're taking more. 202-521-1320. One quick comment on the Mike Lindell thing, with starting his own social media network or his own social network. I'm a relatively young dude. I'm 28 years old, so I'm going to give an example that sort of predates my time. But I know at one point there was a period, and it probably still is now to some extent, where like a prestige project that you could engage in if you were a celebrity, if you'd made your name in something, you'd made a bunch of money, and you wanted to spend that money and make more, you would like start a franchise restaurant, that kind of thing, where it's like, I just know that there was a wave of people who did this, and I don't know how big it was, but I know that it's happened. I know that there are other examples more recently, but it feels like we're on the verge of something like that with social media networks. Seeing Mike Lindell, a dude coming up in an unrelated industry completely, and now a political player, weirdly enough, creating his own social media network. I guess the more the merrier, I guess. But, there's something about network effects and splitting people up into these different platforms, and how while that may add some resilience to the internet as a whole, it's also separating people and probably not as effective as having some protocol where people can communicate across social media networks. I don't know. It's a little bit detailed. Do you have any thoughts on that, Jamarl?
Not entirely. I guess the social media thing is strange. I mean, because you kind of do want a system where people can populate. Otherwise, it almost defeats the purpose of it. If I am on, Boogaloo in, I don't know, Timbuktu, I can't really talk to the people that are in America if they're on Twitter. And if you have 20 of these social networks, because governments have gotten to the point of believing that these things were used for malicious purposes. Like if you're using Twitter and you're a government, you can, it's nothing for you to pay a little body of people, let's say $50,000 a year, and let's say you have 100 of them, to create all sorts of accounts to attack political enemies, to go after people in country, out country, etc. Meaning it doesn't take anything or a small amount of investment for social media to be used as a weapon. And that doesn't even get into like hacking tools and all this other stuff. So maybe, there's an impetus for countries to potentially do that on some level, unless, but I agree with you on, I think, Shane, that there's something to be said about social media that requires it to be social. And if you lose that element of social, then it loses, on some level, its value. Yeah, I think I can agree with that. Michael from Sydney. Michael, what's going on, man? You doing all right?
Yeah, not bad. Thanks, guys. Not bad. I've just been busy lately. I just wanted to, I was picked up on the conversation you're talking about new monetary theory, about the idea of giving a universal basic income. And look, I'm not against giving poor people money because it does get spent. But I think it's really the problem really is not much of that money. Okay, yeah, they get the commodities for it, but they it's the corporations that pocket the profit. And most of the products they buy aren't from America or in their own country. They're produced in another country, so the money outflows to that country. And basically, yes, they get the commodity, but the government's left holding the debt, and effectively they're left holding the debt. The real problem is you're sort of tinkering, you're paying, you're changing deck chairs on the Titanic. The real problem is you got to change the mode of production. You're just tinkering around the edges. You look at the factors of production: who owns the land, who owns the capital, are the workers in charge of the industry? They own their own company. How's the distribution of wealth of the corporations and businesses they work in done? Do they have control of the businesses they work in? Because really, all you're doing is, you're giving money to people, and
it's a bribe,
relieving their burden at the time, but you're not actually changing the foundations of that system.
Yeah, it's a bribe. It's basically a bribe. Say for example, Jeff Bezos has 100, let's say 200 billion. It's not that much, but he's nearing 200 billion. If you decide to say, all right, we're going to give people a stipend, let's say $1,000 a month. Well, that guy may have more agency to say, okay, I'm going to work for McDonald's or this other place, but he's basically being given that. And at any point that can be taken away. He has no power over the means of production. He has no more agency in his job or work other than saying, I may take this job or that job. And all of those people who are basically the moneyed class have now created a situation to bring down the hysteria that's in the country while simultaneously maintaining control of all the levels of production. Yeah, that's a bribe. It's a problem. Michael, great eye, good insight. What do you think, Shane?
Okay, so yes, first of all, it is a bribe. Politically, that's been my problem with the universal basic income for a long time, not just in the moment based on who's guaranteeing it, but in the long run, you're effectively, here's the deeper thing, and Michael gets it, I think, a large part of it with who is actually in control, who owns the capital that you're talking about, whether it is literal financial capital or whether it's assets like land, or even frankly, whether it's social capital, if you're talking about social media networks. You can control the conduits of society in some sense by determining what people talk about, how they think, that kind of thing. In a very real sense, if you lack control, then money doesn't actually matter. Money gets you what you would continue to need to survive, but you lack what you'd need to be an actual thriving human being. And what's an alternative to this? I briefly mentioned once before, a long time ago at this point, obliquely, the idea of like a universal basic means of production. And I'm not saying anything communistic there. I don't know exactly what I mean by that, but I think it's a little bit more on the point, where whether it's 3D printers, as sort of silly and facile as that would seem to me, because that's one small thing and they're not actually panning out as well as people had hoped at first, or whether that's like independent local self-sufficiency in terms of land, where different communities shared land and had local land that they could use to grow their own crops and live on and do the sort of basic stuff that you'd want, forestry and harvesting timber. I mean, my mind is going to like stuff that you would have been doing 1,000 years ago. So maybe that's not the most forward-thinking way of looking at this stuff. But I guess what I'm saying is, if there were another way of approaching these things where individual people and the communities that they lived in on a local scale had the control of the resources they needed to support themselves, on the one hand, you could quote John Donne, where no man is an island entire of itself, and you don't want people split up and competing with each other on this basic level where there's no sense of common unification or a common pursuit of a common goal. But on the other hand, I don't think humans are actually like that. I don't know. I'm getting really philosophical with this stuff, but I think something like that would be better and a little bit more on point than a universal basic income. Because after all, if you're creating the goods yourself and sort of tailoring your community to live in the way that you'd want to live in, you're going to be better off. You're going to have more control over your life. You'll probably be a more responsible thinker in your society. You'll be more engaged. There are all these different arguments for it, but I don't know exactly what I mean, and I don't really see many people talking about it. What's your take, Jamarl?
I think what you're talking about are two things. Self-sufficiency in one case, meaning an individual's ability to be self-sufficient when it's own right, per se. Like if his energy production was there, maybe solar powers and batteries and everything else just in every house. If he didn't necessarily have to get water from some other source, or if he did get water from a source, let's say it's free. Meaning him having the ability to be to be fulfilled, kind of Maslow's theory of needs. He has the things that he needs to be a fully affirmed person. From that point, he can operate in the world. Whether that's him having a job, him having agency in that job, and all of those things I think are vitally important. I think the thing is, human beings are both. They can be greedy, but they also can be magnanimous, and they can be gracious. It just depends on the incentives of the environment that pushes them one way or the other. And if we crafted an environment that had incentives that work with the notion of cooperation as opposed to everything being this kind of competitive race to the bottom, we'd have a different world. I think it's as straightforward.
That's true,
as
but
that.
But it's a chicken and egg thing, and we've got a minute left, so maybe we have no time for philosophy. But you also have to have the right person to pursue that environment. Kant, the philosopher Immanuel Kant, talk about, he would praise economics because even the worst kind of person, even a purely self-interested devil, would pursue the common good through the right kind of economic arrangement. I don't think I want to live in a society that's filled with devils. And frankly, I don't think devils would I don't think a purely self-interested person, a society composed of that, would create a good society to live in. So I think you're right in some sense. Yeah, you need an environment to give people the opportunity to become the right kind of person. But on the other hand, you also need the right kind of people to create that environment. And I don't know how you resolve that, but we're at a time hope you stuck with us through that admittedly slightly confusing closer to this show. We'll be back tomorrow, folks. Thank you everybody for calling in. Thank you to our guests. Thanks to Jamarl for co-hosting this with me. Thank you, Engineer Andre. Thank you, Producer Mary T. And thank you for listening. We'll be back tomorrow at 7 a.m. Eastern. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Have a great day and see you on the other side.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Another one is in the record books. I actually think Shane may be calling in. We're talking about having an after show. So let's see if Shane is going to call in. I'll give it a moment. Good show today. Strong show. It wasn't necessarily huge on the argumentation until it got to Mark Frost. But the interviews had pep. They had speed. They were interesting. You could see kind of how America intersects with it. If we're saying things that are critical, we're saying those things because we want this world to be better. That's it. No more, no less. If I'm adding context because I feel like the perspective that is given gives people a false sense of knowledge when they're talking about an issue and they're running with an American perspective from, let's say, something they heard on CNN or MSNBC or Fox News. It's often jaded, and in missing that perspective allows people or pushing it in a certain direction, a certain point of view. And my job that I have taken is to basically, this is the larger context. Make whatever choice you want, but this is the larger context. And yeah, I take that job I relish that job. Absolutely relish it. All right, I don't know if he's here, so I'm going to make this one last pitch or one last thing. Our new producer has been on the ball. And it is possible that we may be getting Luis Elizondo on Fault Lines. You have no idea. I am on cloud 9. And so we are working behind the scenes to try to make that work. And again, there will be another new person that we're bringing to the network, Fault Lines flagship show. And he's here. All right. So Shane and I are going to have our after show. Now, these after shows, we do this every show. And basically, at the end of the show, we talk and try to get our heads right if there's anything that bothered us during the show between us. Or for that matter, if we're talking about the guests and everything else, this is kind of how we do this. And so the thought was spend 5 or 10 minutes or so just having the after show online, since these shows, I think, oftentimes are entertaining or as entertaining or close to entertaining as the show. So Shane is here. Welcome.
Hey, what's up?
There he is. Now, I can see you, Shane, even though you can't see me. I'm bouncing back and forth between the Skype and my own format. So you're visible and I'm visible. So for the first time, people can see a living, moving picture of the one elusive Shane Stranahan. And so welcome, man. Welcome to the after show.
Thank you. Since folks can see me, I'm leaning off to the right because my mic is over here. I've got kind of a weird setup. But how are you all doing? Hope you're having a good morning.
Excellent. So I wanted to just do a brief rundown of the show. What did you think? Any issues, any weirdness, any bizarre feelings that you were doing it? Like, oh God, this wasn't working. I thought it was a decent show. I thought it was upbeat. I didn't think it lagged. But what are your thoughts?
I thought it was great. I think, especially compared to Monday. I think Wednesday, I forget exactly what it was, but yesterday there was stuff that I was quibbling with, but nothing really bad. I think Monday was the worst show this week. Tuesday was great. Today's show is probably the best, actually. In literally every conversation we had, I felt like we could have been talking about more with the guests. So, and I like being in that space. You know, I never felt like there was a drag or we had time to fill or anything, which is not a good place to be in. So I thought it was good.
Yeah, that's never a good place to be. It's like, oh God, we should have. It's like we need to end this break early. That's not a good place to be. No, I agree with you. I think, I don't know if I think this one is the best show, but I do think. I thought the other one, like a couple of days ago, was one of the best. But either way, this week has been strong, and so that's all that matters. This week has been very strong. I was telling them that we may get the potential for Luis Elizondo, and I was telling them that our producer has been on the ball on that stuff. So
yeah, no, Mary T has been great. Yeah, from I think that like literally the first day that she was on the team, she was on the ball. She was pushing for. I mean, I forget exactly what it was, but we had like asked in the back thread that we do in the Google Doc. We'd asked like sort of generally to book a guest, and she was right on it. And then since then, she's come up with a lot of really good ideas, including like reaching out to officials from other states to see if we can get them on. And so, yeah, she's been on point on this.
Yeah, she's been definitely on point. And so I've been thinking of questions, like, because my thing is, he was the guy that was running the project, and he has all sorts of stuff that he knows that he doesn't want to tell. And I feel like it's our job to plumb the depths and to pluck that information out so people can know it. Now, I don't want him to be shot or anything like that. You know, it's like after the interview on Fault Lines, Luis Elizondo wakes up when they found him in a bullet in his head or something like that. I don't want that at all. I don't want that. Oh. It's like, because what's his name? I can't think of his name. Bob Lazare. He said, he made the point, he said, they told him, it said, this bullet has your name on it if you fuck around with us. It was one of those like very specific things. Lazare has a lot of problems with his case. By the same token, Lazare has a lot of right with his case. Meaning there's so many quirks in that case of people who could cooperate the fact that he was there. He knew the things that were going on at the base. He revealed to the world that Area 51 existed. That wasn't even a known thing until he came out with it. So it's like he has this information. Nevertheless, he is such a controversial figure for the shit that he said. And so he's always a weird case. But that was one of the things. It was like there's a bullet with your name on it. So I think him and I think Bob Bigelow have things that they know based on their special access clearance that they can't tell. And the question is, how do you get that information? And I was even thinking of like being like, look, Louise, if I ask you something and you can't answer it, just say, I can't answer this because of secrecy reasons. Like maybe it's like throwing paint at the invisible man. I can't necessarily get to figure out what's there, but I know something is there based on the paint that's circling that blank spot that's in the context of this. Like, I've been thinking of all sorts of stuff. Because if you ask him something, he basically said, that's a state secret. Okay. All right. Is it a state secret in the sense because it's a yes? Or is it a state secret because it's a no? And either way, it's interesting that it's a state secret at all.
You're talking about trying to like triangulate in on it.
Yeah.
Because you can't say some stuff, but you can get him to say what he can't say, etc. And so you can use the negative to prove the positive or whatever the case may be.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like throwing talcum powder at something in the room that you can't see. And the talcum powder gets all over it. It leaves footprints and that type of stuff. Maybe it's that. I'm just trying to, that no one else has had. And I want to get information out of him that nobody else has gotten. And I've been strongly thinking about that. I think one of the other ways I've even thought was to use him for my resource. To be like, look, Luis, there's things that you know that you can't tell. And because you know those things, I wouldn't have the experience to even know what to ask you because I didn't experience it. Based on what you know, what is the most important thing that nobody's asked you? I was even thinking of stuff like that. Like get as close as possible to something that would get you shot. And a nanometer away from that, tell me what that is. Like I've been thinking of all these clever ways. So yeah, I'm enthused about that. Mariti is getting free pizza from me, man. To put it mildly, on her first day back. So, but no.
She's doing a great job.
Yeah. Let's get back to the show for a moment. Anything? Let me see. I'm trying to think. Vanessa Beeley, I thought that was a good interview. I thought Alan was good. Alan was great, actually. He could, his knowledge of that stuff is on point. And he wrote the book on Venezuela. Yeah, he wrote the book.
He did. Yeah. He has an interesting presence. He's pretty sort of calm and collected, but very clear and eloquent. I'm honestly, and I'm not just saying this because we're doing the after show publicly for the first time. I literally can't think of any valid criticism that I can level against us today. I think we did it.
No, trust me. If it was bad, we would say so. I mean, we said so one day. I think I said so on the show Monday. I was like, God, man, this show went weird.
Yeah, Monday felt very weird. Monday felt too slow, and I couldn't tell if that was just because I gotten a little bit less sleep the night before than I'm used to getting or something. But Monday was a little bit weird. But today, if I had to bring up one quibble, and this is nothing literally, it was just that we didn't have the audio clip pulled when you went to play it at the end of the 9:15 segment. But that's small beans. We got to it just a couple minutes later. So.
Yeah, the Honduras one. Yeah. Firing all cylinders. All right, well, we can end it. I mean, no, I thought it was good, man. Good job today. And this is not just pat on the backs. That's not what it is. I guess it is, but it's not in a craven way.
No, if shit goes wrong, we're clear about it. We talk
Yeah,
about that.
yeah.
We
It's
do
like that interview went horribly awry. It's like I couldn't figure out another question, or maybe there was another way to hit it. No, yeah, we can be pretty vicious.
And clearly, we'll talk about this later, but for tomorrow, I think the only guest we have lined up right now is Margaret Kimberly for a half hour. We just need to figure out when she's on.
What do you want to talk to her about that? I mean, because we tried to get her Wednesday to talk about the Royals, and honestly, I wanted to talk to Mercouris about the Royals. I hated his take on that. I just didn't get the chance to get to it.
I didn't.
So he had a conversation on the Duran, and he was basically arguing that she was virtue signaling, that this was all her playing the race card, and that Harry is in a horrible situation because he's been pulled from his family, and things are going to turn out bad for him. And it's like, well, that stuff is subjective, first. And you don't know if she was playing the race card with a certain malicious intent, meaning she could just see the world that way. And I'm saying that from people who I've known who are mixed, where they take a side. It's like they take a clear ideological orientation around this thing of race because of a discomfort in regards to race. They're always put in this kind of double consciousness in the same way that African Americans are on some level. It's like when you are engaging something, you know in your head you're black or you're African American or you have that ancestry. You also know in your head that there's a distribution of people in the country that will treat you unfairly because of it, even if you don't know who those people are. And because of that, you're stuck with this question always. Is this person engaging with me this way because of issues of race? And in the same way that the Chinese were not going to admit that they were trolling when they were taking the ass swabs, you have the same thing with people not going to admit that it was issues of race. Now, this is problematic, right? Because this means that people who are not racist may get called racist for doing something that they did that could have been accidental or that they could have just been incompetent on. And people who are doing racist shit sometimes get the benefit of the doubt, saying, well, we don't know that, I don't know that, etc. Meaning you're always stuck in this situation of almost being in a religious situation. I don't know what I don't know. And I can't tell what's in that guy's head. I have no capacity to read that guy's mind. And so now I'm stuck deciphering clues. And how I decipher those clues are going to be entirely based on how I was raised, what I saw in my society. So when Alexander looks at this and he says she's virtue signaling, she's playing the race card. Maybe she is, maybe she's not. Maybe she had a point. Maybe there was something there where she saw. Or maybe there was nothing there. It's so subjective that trying to take this kind of hard point of view of she's doing something malicious is problematic to me. Now,
I hear you.
I mean, that's the only place I'm going with that. She might not have been looking at this stuff in those malicious terms. It literally, honestly could have been, they asked about my baby skin color, I have an issue with that. Or I felt like they were treating me differently, I have an issue with that. And he even took issue with her comparing it to Diana. It's like saying, well, you know, she's saying it's race, but Diana was part of the royal family and everything else. And it's like, whether she's saying it's about race or whether Diana was about the royal family or not, you're missing her point. She's making the point that it's dangerous. And in the same way Diana died, that she felt like her life was at stake also. It's not about the race thing in this case. It's about the fact of tabloids and how they treat royalty, especially new people in royalty. He didn't give a shit about any of that.
But if we'd gotten into that conversation with him, it's like a sort of a catch-22, or not exactly, but if all the time we had was to talk about the serious issue at hand, we wouldn't have had time to get to what I feel is the deeper issue, like we were talking about the other day, which is why the hell are we still talking about the monarchy in Britain? What's the relevance of that? And in my opinion, he, you know, from the fact that he has a view on the point, a view on the issue, and he's talking about it on his platform, he probably believes they do continue to have a relevance, that there's some merit in talking about them. In my opinion, that's an interesting conversation. But if we're going to talk about it, I feel like if we only have enough time to talk about the point that he's making, we don't have a chance to get into the interesting one. Does that make sense? And I would want to get into that.
Yeah,
because
totally.
I feel like he'd have an interesting take on it.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. I mean, because that's like a 15-minute segment by itself. And he would give a probably more nuanced take, because we're having the conversation with him. I just think Britain looks at this differently than America. And America with the racial history, and look, Britain has its own racial history, even though I don't necessarily think they consider it in the same way. I mean, you had all of these colonialism, colonies and everything else. Hell, we were in Kenya several years ago, and you should see what Britain was doing in their kind of this apartheid way that they would separate groups. Had them making coffee and tea, but they were illegal. What, tea was illegal or something? Like, it was very weird, the rules they were putting in place. But in America, it runs so deep that this stuff is like they're ignoring the fact that she's from here. Like, she's not British. So her take on that stuff is going to be uniquely American because she's an American. And if she's mixed, I give you a perfect example. My niece, my wife's niece is mixed, and she argued one time that a white person wearing braids was cultural appropriation and wrong. And her got into this big fight over it. It's like, how the hell are you going to tell somebody else what they can do with their own body? And even if they were culturally appropriating, so the fuck what? It's their hair. They can do whatever they want. And it's even somewhat of a approval of sorts or accolades for even doing it. Like, but in her head, white people shouldn't do that. She's mixed. She's overcompensating. There's like Worf and Cleons. Worf overcompensates for Cleons because he had human parents. The same difference. And so it's like you have people who function from that way. Mercouris may not know that because he's a Brit. I don't know. It's a good conversation, but like you said, I wouldn't want to use the entire time we have on Mercouris on that. Oh, I can't hear you, Shane. Mute.
Thank you. I'm usually better about that. This is completely random, but because I'm watching your feed, I can see you have the picture of Q in the background. Q from Star Trek. He like takes a very central place right to the left of your head in the feed. What is the significance of Q?
This is my man cave. And if I pan around, I have, if you're walking down the steps, I'm not sure one day, as you go down the steps of my man cave, there are pictures. When you first come down, I think it's me sword fighting with the guy in Rome, or me having a fight with the guy with a knife in Rome. There's another one with me bungee jumping, zip lining, all that stuff, looking like Batman coming down the zip line. And then as you go through, you have wedding pictures. You have my mom's wedding. You have other family pictures of my wife and everything else. When you get into the room, you have all of the like travel photos with the maps and everything else. So this side of this is just my Star Trek or that type of memorabilia. It was signed by Q.
Oh, really?
Yeah, all of these are signed. Like this one is signed. That one is signed by Data. Oh wait, that's not signed by Data, but that's Data's picture. That one is signed by Q. That one is signed by Data. Oh, right. Data and Worf signing the other one. Interesting story, right? Q is a Democrat. He's a traditional Democrat. So when I met him at Comic-Con, he basically makes a point. He says, "What do you do?" I say, "I do the news. That's what I do, goddammit." And he says, "Really?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "Are you telling people to vote for Democrat?" And I said, "Oh, fuck." I love Q's character. Like, he's one of my favorite characters on Star Trek. I didn't have the heart to tell that man no and to go all in on why he shouldn't be voting for Democrats and everything else. Only thing I could tell him, I could muster up was, I think people should vote for who's going to represent their interests. That's all I could tell him, right? I didn't want to get into, it's Q. I loved his character. I don't want to get into a fight over this guy in politics. Like, do you know how weird that would be at Comic-Con? Him and I going back and forth over who people should vote for and whether or not I want to push people to vote for this guy, that guy. I don't want that fight. I don't want that fight.
And it's funny, too, because Q is such a cynical... I haven't watched that much Star Trek, but I've watched enough to know. Q is such like a cynical character on the human condition. And so you'd think that maybe the actor playing him could see some of that and apply it to the Democratic Party. But hey,
to put it in perspective, he held Picard on all of the charges for all of the crimes of man. Think about that. The man from the beginning of time and the behavior of man. And he basically said, you are not sufficiently matured to come out into the universe. Yeah. And basically held Picard up on charges. He says, I'm charging you with all of the crimes of humanity. And went through decade after decade, century after century, era after era, showing the failures of humanity, showing the things that they were doing, the killings and everything else. And Picard was horrified by this and would not accept the charges. It was such a fascinating thing because Picard is representative of man. And Q was basically their way of saying, are you ready for the challenges that await you in the cosmos, in the galaxy? Picard's answer was yes. And Q's answer was, You have all of these things that you're dragging with you into space, and you need to account for those things. And
That's the first episode of the Next
first
Generation.
episode.
But then Picard manages to sort of vindicate humanity, and Q lets him.
He does,
lets him
yeah.
pass, you know?
He vindicates humanity, kind of. I mean, because Q's argument is the test never ended.
Yes, that is true.
That's his argument. But yeah, he let Picard out in the galaxy when Picard was able to say. And there's another aspect to this. When Picard sees Q, his response is, "What sort of being are you?" He didn't assume that he was God. If we see a being materialize in our room and express powers like that, what would we say? Like, I'm trying to get to the level of development of humanity at that point, where Picard could look at him and say, "What sort of being are you?" as opposed to thinking this is some kind of religious thing. It's astonishing, because where does Q live? What does that mean from the standpoint of dimensions and dimensionality? What does it mean from the standpoint of humanity being projected, or this reality being projected from somewhere else? Which is some of the theories and hypotheses that the scientists come to. If you're Picard and you're dealing with a being that is on a different spectrum of reality, what does that make you think of yourself in the context of reality?
Okay, so I have not gotten far enough into it to know. Does that question ever get answered? Like later in the series, is the nature of Q?
No.
Get more into that?
No, because they can't answer it. It's because Star Trek, the beauty of Star Trek, it doesn't give you hard answers because they can't give you a hard answer. If humanity has a perspective, that's all it is. If you have, let's say, 1 billion beings in space, those beings are going to be raised a particular way, grow in a society that's built in a particular way. They're going to think of the world in a particular way. Their resources and access to those resources are going to be different, meaning they may be using different chemicals or different compounds than we are using. All of that stuff is going to be different. Even the physical attributes that they have as they interact with this physical matter reality, it's going to be different. They're going to have a point of view. That point of view is just a point of view. Just like humanity has a point of view, just like Cleons have a point of view, just like Cardassians. And none of those points of view are right or wrong in comparison to how they line up with physical matter reality.
Jamarl, this is another off the wall question. What probability would you give to the idea that Star Trek was an alien psyop to try to bring humanity up to the moral par that they expect from entrance to the galactic civilization or civilizations or whatever?
Is that where we're going? I've thought about that. Honestly, I've thought about that. Like, if you needed to, I've even thought about that with what is the one with the triangle and everything else? Third Contact of the Third Kind or something like that. Like, if your government wanted to get information out to you, how do they do it? Is it with a soft touch or is it with a harder touch? Meaning, if I need to get the public up to speed on the alien thing, because I think there's something out there, even though I don't necessarily know what the thing is. Let's say I do know. Let's say I don't know. We need to get the public up to speed. How do we do it? Is it possible that movies like Contact or movies or television shows, that these things are ways of inserting this into the public consciousness?
Contact is great.
Contact is an amazing film.
I loved that growing up. My mom loved that one too.
And that's kind of my point, though. Like, if you get so indoctrinated or so accustomed to alien films to the point where everybody knows what a gray alien looks like, think about that. Everybody knows what a gray alien looks like, even though many people don't even believe in aliens, or many people don't even believe they can get here, and yet everybody knows what a gray alien looks like. Why? Why is that the figure that people aggregate around when they talk about this is what I saw, this is what I interact with? And the UFO in Turkey that I was showing you guys, the figures that were in it looked like the gray aliens that people depict. So, like, is it possible that this stuff is being introduced on some kind of higher level to try to get the public acclimated to these ideas, even if it's not necessarily given it to them as a flat fact way? Because think about how you do. Like, you have been, from the day that you were born to now, there have been movies, television shows talking about space, aliens, UFOs, etc. It acclimates you on some level. So I don't know. That's a good question, Shay. We can ask Luis. We can ask. That's the question for Elizondo. No, seriously, he is guiding very out there in some of his commentary, like about like what's in the ships and stuff like that. If you notice, they don't talk about that. They never discuss that. They don't bring it up. They just talk about it as technology. But technology driven by who? In pursuit of what? For what reason? And those things go into intent. And intent is what is driving it, or for that matter, what is flying it. And so,
yeah, that, you know, I mean, coming back to that interview, I haven't watched I think I've watched very brief clips of interviews with him, but you clearly know a lot more than I would. It would be interesting to figure out what we could hit him with in terms of questions. Not only that he'd be reticent to answer, like you were talking about, in order to figure out what he can't say, that kind of thing, but also just what does he not usually get asked about? Like this as an example. Culturally, what would they be pushing for, assuming there is a they out there? Because that's super interesting too. And I'm guessing, from what you've said at least, I'm guessing he doesn't get asked about that. So like there's a comparative advantage for talking to him about that stuff.
No, I agree. I just want him to answer stuff that he hasn't been hit with before. That's what I want. And even if we can make a model where it's like, I can't answer that, I can't answer that, I can't answer that. And you're like, all right, around this question, there's something there that is not being told. Even that's, valuable. So, I don't know. I'm looking forward to it. And so I've been sitting here like thinking through like, all right, how do you get him with the question? How do you get him with the question? That type of stuff.
And Cornel West. Have you mentioned Cornel West?
And Cornel West. That's the other one. So Marie T, again, producer, has been on the job and I thought Margaret Kimberly gave us a heads up, but it seems like it might have just been Marie T getting in contact with the secretary. So Cornel West potentially will be coming on the show also. We're up in our game, man.
That'd be great.
Up in our game.
That'd be very, very good. Next it's Zarif. And,
yeah, that's the other one we want. Yeah.
And I guess the ghost of Hugo Chavez.
Right. Dude, if we could get that, talking about dominating the network. That's my goal. Dominate the network. All right, my man. I'm going to end
it. Raises the standards. Yeah, all right.
Yeah, I know, right? Up the stand. Well, that's the goal, right? Up the standards. I want to be the best team. Look, I'm competitive by nature. And in my head, it's like, be number one. And be number one in such a clear, dominant way that when you walk into meetings, everybody just knows that you're number one. There'll be some people who are like, wow. And there'll be other people who are like, fuck that guy. But either way, everybody knows 3 a.m, between them and their God, that Fault Lines is the number one show. That's what I want. That's what I want. just being honest. All right, guys, I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, I'm going to say subscribe. Shane, thank you for doing this, my man. I thought this was always cool. So I think some of these are always better, I think, when something goes either monstrously good or monstrously bad.
Yeah, because
doesn't make sense. It's like, yeah,
totally. Yeah, because there's a little bit of the behind the scenes thing, but this is good. Thank you for inviting me onto this kind of thing. I'm glad we're doing it. We should. Keep doing it.
No, man. It's look, this is our show, and I think we've upped our game. My mom has even said, you guys have really kicked it up a notch. Like she says, I've really noticed a difference in your guys' show. And it's like, well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Well, and here's another thing too. I think that for some people in the audience, probably your audience particularly, they hear us like going at it on the show. Like I don't think we've ever gotten into a screaming match or even anything approaching that. And we're like bumping heads on something. But at the end of the day, as well as I do, we have these meetings after the show and we're good. We're good every time. We're always able to come back to a common ground.
Yeah, and just so we're clear, the reason for these meetings, I think both of us look at it this way. It's an argumentative show. Like, you bump constantly. And sometimes you're going to agree with your co-host. Sometimes you're not going to agree. And sometimes it's more interesting when you don't agree just because that intervening point. Also, I think with this show, what's different is it's not a traditional bitch fest. The arguments usually are something that both of us take to heart. And it's usually engaged honestly. And I don't mean like honestly where a Democrat says this in order to fight for this version of the American perspective and this guy's fighting for this version. And we try to say, well, what's honest, what's true, and what's contextually given. And we have those fights. And those fights are usually honest, earnest, and not mean-spirited in the least. And so at the end of it, we just be like, hey, you good? Yeah, I'm good. Or it might be, hey, I didn't particularly like the way you mentioned this. Like, really? My bad, dude. I didn't mean to do that. It's that.
Yeah.
Because it's like, this is our time to try to make everything balanced. Because, the last thing you want is going back into an argumentative show where you guys are not clearing the palette. So,
like happened with the last Fault Lines.
Exactly.
Where shit went horribly awry. One last question, Jamarl. When I get back out to DC, do you want to do a public live stream where you do mushrooms with me for the first time?
Dude, I would totally do that. I would totally do that.
Maybe the second or third time. The only thing is, it could be a hectic thing. So if it's your first time, literally, you might.
That would be some wild shit, man. There's a guy on YouTube that does that. That's his channel does that. I was blown away by his channel because he was telling people about his acid trips, and he was like, yeah, I did acid, I did shrooms, I did DMT, et cetera, et cetera. And he would tell people what he was experiencing during his trips, and I'm always interested in that stuff. And then he does it on camera, like he does it live, where he's like just kind of tweaking out like on camera, and he's like trying to explain what he's experiencing when he's kind of in a tweaking out state. Yeah, I would do it. I would. Yeah, I would do it. I mean, I'm a little self-conscious about doing it on camera just because you don't know what happens.
That's the thing. No, that's the thing. And yeah, no, I was legitimately kidding. I know some folks would be elated to see that, but especially if you're doing it for the first time. I mean, but the thing is, if you were to do it for the first time, it should be like a relatively low dose. It should be something where you can feel the effects, kind of get your feet, see how you respond to it. So I guess that would make a little bit more sense. But there's just pressure being put on you because you're doing it in public. And hey, maybe you want to, if you do it for the first time, maybe you want to do it with Aisha, or on your own or something like that. I don't want to be imposed on.
I'm not sure. I'm always a bit of a bitch on stuff like that. I know that sounds weird, but I inch my way to it. Like usually it's like a little bit, and once I get to the point where I'm like, all right, I'm comfortable, I move further. And I was like that with OBEs. I was like that with meditations and stuff like that.
And Harold Wyatt also brings up a very good point, which is that shrooms are best done outdoors. That's a good general recommendation.
By the way, I've done shrooms once in Amsterdam.
Oh, you have? Oh, I thought you had.
But there was no effect.
Really?
So Amsterdam sells them over the counter, and I bought supposedly it was like more hallucinogenic brand, but they had stronger brands. But again, I had never tried shrooms before, so I bought.
But those are also go for it.
Well, they were dry. It was like dried shrooms. I bought the middle ones. I went to the park, ate the whole pack, and I ate half first. Then I ate the other half. I got lost going back home. And it's possible that like that adrenaline thing of like, oh fuck, I gotta find my way back home. Like screwed with the high. Because at that point I was like, oh fuck, I'm lost. And I'm in a foreign country. I can't speak the language. It was that. And so that faculty started to kick in of, all right, I gotta get home. How do you get home? That type of stuff. But no, I didn't have the effect. So.
Well, one thing about the shrooms and mushroom too, and I mean the mushrooms in Amsterdam, is that they're truffles. They're like a different species than the classic shrooms that you get, but usually when they sell them in Amsterdam, I'm not speaking from personal experience, honestly, I've done shrooms plenty of times, but usually when they sell them wet, from what I know and have read and have talked to people about. So if they sold them to you dry, maybe they're regular, I don't know.
It's a regulation stuff that they started, because they started putting in regulations about people smoking in the cafes and all sorts of stuff, and so yeah, there was just regulation. But no, dude, I'm down. I'm not against it at all. Hell, all of us can
especially do it. We can talk about it. I mean, maybe we talk about it anyway, but it's decriminalized.
That's right.
You can
well, what about DMT? Had you ever considered DMT?
I have done DMT once.
What was your experience on that? Did you see machine elves? Did you get to that point where you were like another zone of sorts, like when these kind of little beings were talking to you and all this stuff? Like, did you get to that point?
I did. I did not see machine elves.
What did they say? What did they say to you?
Have you ever done salvia?
Yes. So, salvia's dividorium.
Yeah, I think it's divinorum or something like that. But yeah, not sage, although I think salvia is a name for sage. Anyway, so for some, I think I've done salvia 2 or 3 times when I was younger, and every time I did it, I had a horrible experience. Usually people, when they do salvia, they often have bad experiences. And for some reason, when I did DMT, it felt like I was communicating with the same beings. It felt like I was communicating with when I was on salvia, but they were telling me dramatically different things. And specifically, I actually did this. I forget what the date exactly was, but remember it was like December 24th, 2012, like the end of the world. There was a big public event where like the world is ending. There's some apocalyptic prediction. I did it the night that was happening. So I don't know how that affected things. It didn't seem to relate to the content of the trip in any way, but basically when I did DMT, what I remember is communicating with these royal beings with like ornate biological jewelry who were trying to communicate to me that I was a part of this like branching tree of DNA that all of life was composed of, and that I was this like individual part of that branch, and somehow just being part of that, like seeing how this stuff all interacts, and specifically like the nature of biology, the nature of DNA, really struck me, and that's what I remember from it.
That's phenomenal. That's so cool. It's like you're part of the whole, even if you're this kind of infinitesimal part, you're still part of the whole, like the fabric of the universe and everything else. The bad trips. That was what happened on the bad trips. Was it visual? Was it hallucination? Was it just like nausea and vomiting? What was the?
It was hallucination. It hits you really hard and really fast, like DMT. And by the way, I did not do ayahuasca. I just smoked DMT very briefly. On salvia, it hits you really hard and really fast, and literally physically 2 of the times at least I was like writhing around on the ground while it was going on. And the one that strikes me most it was like the plasticine material that like beach balls are composed out of, this kind of thick plastic.
Yeah.
I felt like I was trapped inside of these plastic membranes in a universe run by insects. It's kind of random and off the wall, but it felt like I was suffocating, and it was not a good experience. Let me tell you that. That's all.
That is so funny. That's so wild. Wait, what? How did you know they were insects? Is it just you just knew it, or did you see it? Does that make sense?
I remember engaging. It felt like they were trapping me. I can't tell you much more than this because it was a kind of intense experience, and my memories of it are distorted, like the way that pain distorts your memories. But yeah, it felt like it's not like they were. I felt like almost like they weren't hearing me, but I was able to hear them, and I didn't like what they were doing or saying. And I've tried to reinterpret it, like, is this a metaphor for society? What was I trapped in? What does this mean? And I don't know.
Man, that's so wild. That's so wild. Yeah, I don't have any. I mean, my experiences, my psi experiences were never drug induced. Like it was always like OBEs, lucid dream states. It was always that, and so it was always a little different. I always had my this sounds weird. My awareness with me, but the awareness wasn't necessarily always human. Like a person, yes, but when you are in an out-of-body state, this is going to sound very strange. You don't have your center. You don't have your face, your front. Like oftentimes when we're dealing with people, we have this front up that we engage with them with. Like this is the face that I'm willing to be with. This is the face that I'm ready to get attacked with, et cetera, et cetera. People don't necessarily show who they actually are. When you're engaging with something, somebody says something to hurt your feelings, you don't start crying. You may get bitter. You may not say anything. You may be stoic. You might even just kind of suck it up. But you don't present how you feel at every instance on your face and when you deal with it. It's not that way out of body. You're stuck with what you got. Your body projects whatever the feeling is. And so it's like, you feel bad about something. You cry. Can't help it. You cry. That's the image that's projected. Now, I don't know if this is true for everybody, but in states where I was engaging with something else, it felt that way. It was that way. And so, like, I remember I had this back and forth with my dad. My dad had died. And this was during the time where I started, like, having a lot of lucid dream states. And so I got to the point where I would start to call for things. I would call for my guide or even my dad or whatever. And I remember having these states with my dad. My dad and I always had these kind of difficult relationships. And so it's like, my dream states were trying to work that out after he passed. And I remember he was never around and he was bitter at me for being mad at him during life. And, when I wake up, I'm like, yeah, bullshit. Fuck you, dude. You weren't around. In that state, though, it was this kind of understanding of, yeah, maybe I could have handled that better, despite the fact that he was wrong. And because I could have handled it better, despite the fact that he was wrong, there was sadness on my part at it. It was very strange, but it was very honest. Emotions are complicated. And so it's like, just because the individual was wrong by societal standards in regards to the responsibilities he was supposed to live up to as a dad, doesn't necessarily mean you can act or you should act any particular way as a result. And there are things that are positive in regards to the way you may behave. There are things that are negative. And even in dealing with the individual that fucked up, do you allow a path for retribution? Should you allow a path for retribution? And do you care about it? Which is what matters. And what I mean by care about it, it's subjective to the person. There are some people who are like, yeah, fuck retribution. I don't care. I'm talking about honest, 3 a.m. between you and your God. And there are some people who, like me, become apathetic. But in honest terms, looking at my behavior, in that moment, thought I could have did better. It's honest.
That sounds rough. No,
well, yeah, it's honest. I mean, I've had 3 of those with my dad.
Well, and part of the thing with honesty, like that kind of emotional self-honesty, you need that. And usually when you're processing these kinds of things and it's painful, you're like working through deeper issues, and you need to go through that process in order to grow and in order to sort of reconcile yourself with yourself in some sense.
Yeah.
And I guess what's hardest, of course, is that when people aren't there anymore, it's harder to do. And all that you're left with is that conversation you're having with your memories of them.
Yeah, it's like you're reconciling that stuff with because basically you're projecting an image of your dad. That's your image of him.
Yeah.
And, you know, you are the entirety of that state. You're all of it. And, you know, just because you're lucid, that doesn't really mean anything. I think it gives some kind of callback to our current reality on some level. But in that state, yeah, it's honest. I mean, and it's like the last conversation I think I had with him in one of those states was he said, I'm going to be looking after my brother, meaning my half brother. And that was the last time I saw him. But he, yeah, it was tense. I mean, we had like 2 or 3 of those where it was just kind of just tense, emotionally difficult back and forths of his time here. And it was, you know, it was uncomfortable, but it ended up being somewhat balanced. But it gave context for life. Like in dealing with my aunt and dealing with other people who you may not necessarily be on good terms with. Because at the end of it all, especially if it's somebody who's family or somebody who's close, it almost matters less in a weird way. If something happens to one of my family members, like I have a friend of mine, Jalil. I haven't talked to Jalil in like a decade. Maybe not that long. Over a back and forth that we had over the fucking election with Obama. Because his thing was, oh, the Russians, and Trump and Russians. And I was doing my channel at the time, and I was like, dude, that's bullshit. They're not going to arrest Donald Trump for some kind of Russian nonsense. It's BS. And he's like, watch, they're going to perp walk him. I said, perp walk him on what? What are you getting him on? He didn't have any answers. And it got to the point where I was like, dude, you need to change the conversation because we can't, you know, this can't keep going on like this. It was contentious. But if anything ever happened to him, I wouldn't think about that shit at all. I wouldn't care, you know? And so it just depends on what it is. It depends on the person and all that stuff. But I know in that very specific case, you only get one dad. And for me, it was like something in me needed to work that out. So
yeah, I mean, it is those specific instances with people you love. And I've had a few of these, thankfully. A lot of like my parents. I lost all my grandparents at a pretty young age, but all my parents are still like, I got 2 sets of parents, 2 step parents. And if they were to die, I have shit that I need to work out with each of them. And what I would hope, I should work this out before they pass or before I pass. What I would hope is that like there is something on the other side, not just so they would continue existing, you know, after they were to pass away, but so that if there was something they wanted to hear from me, I would be able to say it to them, and they would be able to get that sense of closure or reconciliation or moving on, and that sense of deeper love. And that is what is hardest about losing people, is that gets cut off. It's not just that you can't be around them anymore. It's that I would want them to have that satisfaction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course it makes sense. It's like you care about them as individuals and about them as being more than meat sacks. And there's something about the intellectual capacities of the individual and knowing that they're whole. Like, for example, I don't want my dog to suffer. And it kills me when my dog suffers. Like Bo, when Bo died, that hurt. And that hurt in a brutal way that I don't think I felt before. And I know that sounds very strange because it's a dog. But the thing that would fuck with me was that how he died. Like the stomach exploding, the cancer, and it's like you get into your head that, for fuck's sake, we were trying to feed him for the last 2 weeks. And he was basically in severe pain those weeks. And so that burns. It's not the fact that he died, it's the fact that he suffered that makes it worse. And so it's like, on some level, yeah, you would want those people that you care about to be intact. And whether that's here or whether that's having some kind of balancing or closure if something else exists. I would say at the point where if nothing is there, then it's a moot point, right?
Yeah.
But at that point, the closure is all yours. And
well,
then
I've heard this interesting argument made before that if you look at every major spiritual tradition in the world, including the quote unquote non-spiritual ones, even if you look at like tech types with this sort of singularitarian vision of things, one of the things that they all have in common, in fact, maybe the thing that they all have in common, is that somewhere at the end of time or outside of time, every living and conscious being comes together in a kind of integrated unity where there's perfect acceptance and perfect communication. And whether you're looking at the Judeo-Christian tradition, you know, if you're looking at Islam, or even some of the variants of Buddhism, I think that there's something that we really deeply want, even if you just look at that materially. You know, if you don't consider the spiritual merits of the arguments themselves, there's something really deeply humanly, psychologically rewarding about coming together in this reconciliation and being together in this community that is in perfect love and harmony that we really want and need. And, you know, so you get hints of that in life. And I wish we had more of it, but it's just interesting.
I think whatever that is, it needs to be translated into a political context because Lord knows we need it. And, you know, Marianne Williamson talks a lot about this stuff, but it is hard translating that into politics. It's just like, because what I mean by that is into laws that foster that. Human beings can be vicious, vindictive, but they can also be loving and work in a collective fashion for the whole. It depends on what and how they're encouraged and how they're pushed. And so, yeah,
I hear you. I hear you on that. My trouble, I guess, my trouble with those sorts of things in politics is that politics is, to put it almost metaphysically, politics is the realm of power, and power tends to distort and corrupt. It's like if you think about the history of societies, the pursuit of individuals within those, it's a weird contradiction because we're talking about the antithesis of power, which is everybody having perfect understanding and harmony, and in some sense being on the same level, which of course power is the exact opposite of. You have power over other people. And therefore, it's like, if politics is the realm of power, it's this weird inversion of pursuits where you're trying to use this tool for this other thing, which in some sense, literally every society does. Like if every society has a vision of the good that they're trying to enact through power, that vision is in some sense the antithesis of, I don't know if this is making sense, it's the antithesis of power. So there's this weird contradiction that we're always pursuing at the same time. I guess to sum up, I just have these hesitancies about using power or politics as a tool to achieve these deeply human needs, because I feel like it's always going to corrupt them, and it's always going to deeply confuse us about who we are, what we want, what we're capable of, how we interact. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. You're thinking that, but that makes sense in our context, not necessarily in a larger context. Like, it's making the assumption or postulating the assumption that power in and of itself allows agency, and that agency is going to go to a group or faction or individual to do what they will, not necessarily what the whole will. Because at that point, they have all the gains. You know, I have the power to enact this or that. What do I want to do? And the public says X, and he's like, ugh, I kind of don't want to do that, so I'm going to go with Y. It's that I think you're thinking of. But a society doesn't have to produce people that want to use power entirely for their own self-interest. That's just how we do it. And I would even argue that our economic system drives that individuality, that competitiveness. I don't know how you have a political system that is not competitive while simultaneously having an economic system that is. It's just, I think all of these things are interrelated. Yeah, the power thing, I totally get where you're coming from with that. It's just, you know, we function oftentimes as individually for our own self-wants as opposed to for the larger collective. But it doesn't have to be that way. That's all I'm saying. It's just the way we do it, unfortunately. Dude, thank you for joining me, man. This was fun. We ended up spending far more time than I thought we were going to spend. But look, these are our after shows. I mean, honestly, when after the show, we kind of just have these conversations about either this show or what's coming up for tomorrow. We got into this weirdness just because we were talking about Louis Elizondo earlier, where I was. Because we want him on the show, and we think we might.
But we will, to our credit, we will also get into this kind of thing randomly too.
Yeah, right. So. That too.
Anyway,
all right, guys.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man.
I'm going to say like. I'm going to say share. I'm going to say subscribe. Shane, thanks, man. I'll see you 12:30. All right, bye-bye. All right, guys. I'm going to say like. I'm going to say share, and I am going to say subscribe. Thanks, everyone.